What's up, guys? Welcome to Muse Fanfiction. We've got something special today. What if Ryuk dropped the death note into the cupboard and Harry decided to purge the Ministry of Magic? Don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's dive in. Chapter 1, The Cupboard Speaks. The cupboard under the stairs at number 4, Privet Drive, was exactly 31 inches wide. Harry knew because he'd measured it with a piece of string he'd found in Dudley's old toy pile, back when Dudley had gone through a phase of wanting to be a cowboy. He'd measured everything in the cupboard, eventually. The length, 62 inches, just enough to lie flat if he tucked his knees a certain way. The height at the tallest point, 44 inches, which meant he could sit up straight only in the very middle, right under the slope of the stair above. He'd measured because it gave him something to do in the dark, and because knowing the exact dimensions of your prison felt, in some small defiant way, like owning it. He was 9 years old and he already understood that knowledge was the only thing the Dursleys couldn't take from him. They took everything else. Food, when he was being punished. The thin blanket, during the hotter months when Aunt Petunia decided he didn't deserve comfort. Dudley had smashed Harry's one Christmas pencil against the garden wall 2 years ago, laughing that high wet laugh of his, and Uncle Vernon had watched from the kitchen window and done nothing at all. The Dursleys operated on a principle Harry had taken a long time to articulate but had eventually managed. They didn't hate him precisely. They feared what he was, and because they couldn't destroy it, they tried to shrink him down around it, compress him into something small enough that the strangeness might suffocate. It hadn't worked. The strangeness kept getting out. The teacher's wig had turned blue the week before. Harry genuinely hadn't meant that one. He'd just been sitting in class thinking very hard about how much he'd like Mrs. Colton to stop calling on him in that particular tone of bright, performative pity she used whenever she remembered he was the Dursley charity case, and then the wig had turned the exact color of the biro he'd been holding, and the class had gone silent, and Harry had looked at the ceiling and thought, not again. Uncle Vernon had locked him in the cupboard for 4 days after that. Bread twice a day. The light bulb had burned out on day 2, which was fine because Harry had memorized the shape of everything in there anyway, could navigate it entirely by touch. On day 4 he'd lain on his back in the dark and thought very calmly about what he would do if he had any power at all. He'd thought about it quite specifically. Not vague revenge fantasies the way he suspected most boys his age had, he'd moved past those when he was 7. He thought about systems. The Dursleys were a symptom, not a disease. The disease was whatever it was that allowed a child to be locked in a cupboard for 4 days without anyone asking a single question, without any neighbor or teacher or distant relative ever deciding that perhaps something was wrong. The disease was the invisible machinery that processed children like Harry and spat them out quiet and compliant and grateful for whatever scraps fell their way. He thought about what it would take to break that machinery. He was 9. He didn't have an answer. But he was already asking the right questions, which was, he would later understand, far more important. The death note fell into his cupboard on a Thursday in October. He heard it before he saw it, a sound like thick paper displaced by air, a soft decisive thump in the dark near his feet. Harry had been sitting cross-legged on his mattress eating the heel of a bread loaf that was 2 days past its best, doing mental arithmetic to keep his mind occupied. He stopped chewing. He waited. He heard nothing else. He reached down in the dark and found it with his fingers. It was a notebook. Thick, the cover smooth and black, the paper inside dense and heavy in a way that good notebooks always were. He turned it over in his hands. No texture on the cover except the words he could feel embossed there, though he couldn't read them in the dark. He found the end of his string, fished along the wall to the light switch, and turned it on. Death Note, it said, in plain block letters on the cover. Harry looked at it for a long moment. Then he opened it. The inside of the front cover was covered in handwritten text, cramped and precise, like someone had tried to fit an instruction manual into the margins of a hymn book. Harry read it once quickly, then went back to the beginning and read it again slowly. The human whose name is written in this note shall die. This note will not take effect unless the writer has the person's face in mind when writing his, her name. Therefore, people sharing the same name will not be affected. If the cause of death is written within 40 seconds of writing the person's name, it will happen. If the cause of death is not specified, the person will simply die of a heart attack. Harry read all the rules. He read them a third time. Then he sat very still for approximately 2 minutes, which for Harry was a very long time to sit still. He did not scream. He did not drop the book. He did not run to the Dursleys. The idea was almost funny, actually, the notion of bursting into the sitting room where Vernon was watching telly and shouting, "I found a magical murder book in my cupboard." He thought about it for exactly 1 second and then discarded it. The Dursleys would take it. Or burn it. Or both. Harry closed the notebook, slid it under his mattress, and ate the rest of his bread. He had questions. He'd need answers before he did anything at all. Ryuk appeared the following Tuesday. Harry had spent the intervening days observing, which he was good at, observing and cataloging and waiting. He'd reread the rules each night before sleeping, committing them to memory, testing his understanding against the edges of each statement. He had not written any names. He understood, with a clarity that surprised even him, that you didn't use a tool before you understood it, and you didn't understand a tool by using it experimentally on living people. He was sitting on his mattress on Tuesday evening, the notebook open to the rules page, when the temperature in the cupboard dropped about 4 degrees and something vast settled into the space that should not have been able to contain something vast. Harry looked up. The creature looking back at him was approximately 7 feet tall, gray-skinned, with eyes like 2 burning lanterns and a grin that stretched too wide in a face built entirely wrong for grinning. It had wings folded against its back like a collapsed umbrella, and it tilted its head when it saw Harry looking at it with no particular expression of terror. It tilted it further, bird-like, assessing. "You're not scared," it said. Its voice was exactly what Harry would have expected, low and textured like old gravel, with something underneath it that might have been amusement. "Should I be?" Harry asked. "Most humans are." "Most humans don't read the rules before the owner shows up," Harry said. "I know what you are. You're the one who dropped this." He held up the notebook. "Shinigami. Death God. Your name is probably in here somewhere." The creature blinked its lantern eyes slowly. "Ryuk," it said. "Harry," Harry said. He lowered the notebook to his lap. "You dropped it on purpose." Ryuk made a sound that might have been a laugh, if a laugh could be stripped of all warmth and just leave the shape of it. "I dropped it because I was bored." "That's not the same as by accident." Another pause. Ryuk's grin, impossibly, widened. "No," it agreed. "It's not." "Right." Harry looked at the notebook, then back at Ryuk. "I have questions." Humans always do. I'm going to assume these rules are accurate and complete unless you tell me otherwise. If there are rules you've left out, now is the time. Ryuk stared at him. "You're 9. I'm aware. Are there rules you've left out?" Ryuk sat down, the floor of the cupboard simply accommodating him in the way that things in the presence of genuine supernatural entities tend to accommodate whether they ought to or not, and considered. "There's more to it than what's written," he said. "Specifics. Extensions. You'll learn as you go. Tell me what you know now." Ryuk, who had expected this to go quite differently, had expected tears, or madness, or that particular variety of human megalomania that had made his last assignment so tiresome, tilted his head again. The boy was sitting cross-legged on a thin mattress in a cupboard under a staircase, wearing a shirt 3 sizes too large that belonged to someone else, holding a death note with both hands and asking for operational briefings. Ryuk had seen a great many humans. He had never seen one quite like this. "You can write conditions," Ryuk said. "Specific circumstances. The person will follow a path of behavior that leads to the death you've written, as long as it doesn't contradict their natural personality entirely." Harry nodded slowly. "So you can engineer it. Within limits." "What limits?" The death has to be physically possible. And if the behavior you specify is something they'd never do, really never, not just wouldn't want to, it won't work. Can I prevent someone from dying? Ryuk blinked. What? If someone's name is in here. Can I prevent the death by destroying the page? Burning the page works, Ryuk said, watching Harry carefully now. Though there are complications. If you've written a death and then destroy the page, the death is cancelled, but there are consequences to the person whose name you've written. Their memory of the period, depending on the circumstances. I'm not planning to use it carelessly, Harry said. I need to understand the full system before I use it at all. And once you understand it. Harry was quiet for a moment. In the small yellow light of the cupboard, he looked utterly ordinary, thin, underfed, with oversized glasses and a scar shaped like a lightning bolt that Ryuk had been told was significant, though he'd never quite cared about the details of human prophecies. He looked like nothing. There's a system, Harry said at last, that takes children and decides, before they're even born, whether they're worth anything. This, he touched the notebook cover, this is leverage. That's all it is. Leverage. Ryuk looked at the boy for a long time. You're not going to go power mad and try to become a god of the new world, he said. It wasn't quite a question. That sounds exhausting, Harry said plainly. And pointless. I don't want to rule anything. I want to fix something specific. That's either very mature, Ryuk said, or very naive. I know, Harry said. He closed the notebook. I'll figure out which one by the time I'm done. He did not use the death note for 2 years. This was not inaction. Harry spent those 2 years the way he spent everything, quietly, efficiently, building the architecture of understanding he needed before he was willing to move. He read. The school library was limited, but he worked through every section of it systematically, and what the school library didn't have, the public library 3 streets over did, if he was willing to walk there on Saturday mornings before the Dursleys were awake enough to notice. He read about government. About history. About systems of law and the ways in which systems of law could be corrupted from within. He read about revolutions, the ones that worked, the ones that failed, and crucially, why. The ones that failed, he noticed, tended to fail not because the revolutionaries were wrong about what was broken, but because they'd moved too fast, or too emotionally, or because they'd torn the structure down without having something to replace it with. He filed this away. Ryuk came and went, which was apparently normal for a Death Note relationship. The Shinigami had no particular investment in what Harry did with his time, and found the long preparatory periods between conversations boring, but would appear when Harry had questions, which Harry always did, thoughtful and specific and often about things Ryuk had never been asked before. Questions about the structure of the Death Note's power. Whether it could be traced. Whether other supernatural entities could detect its use. What happened to the Shinigami if the note changed hands? You're the most annoying human I've ever followed, Ryuk told him, on Harry's 10th birthday, which Harry spent in the cupboard because Uncle Vernon had decided that Harry was responsible for the fact that Dudley's birthday cake hadn't risen properly 3 days earlier. Harry was reading about the French Revolution, which he'd been treating as a detailed case study in what happens when you remove a ruling class without a plan. Is that a compliment? Harry asked, without looking up. It's an observation. Light spent the first week making speeches to himself. Harry looked up at that. Light? Ryuk was quiet for a moment, which for Ryuk was unusual. Previous user, he said, in a tone that suggested the conversation was closed. Harry looked at him for a long moment. He went wrong, Harry said. It wasn't a question either. Yes. How? Another silence, longer this time. He decided he was the answer, Ryuk said finally. Not that he had an answer. That he was one. Harry was quiet, processing this. Then he went back to his book. Thank you, he said, and meant it. The letter from Hogwarts came on Harry's 11th birthday. It didn't come the normal way, not for Harry. Uncle Vernon had apparently received advance intelligence that letters were coming. Later Harry would learn that the headmaster had been keeping an eye on things for years, which produced in Harry a cold, contained fury that he kept entirely off his face, and had escalated from ignoring the post to running away from it, dragging the entire family to a hut on a rock in the middle of the sea. Harry thought this was a fascinating response to a letter. He'd been watching Vernon's panic build over several days with the same analytical interest he brought to everything, and when the knocking came on the door of the hut at midnight on his birthday, he was already awake, sitting cross-legged on the floor of his sleeping bag with the death note open on his knee. Not because he was going to use it. Because he thought better when he was holding it. The door came off its hinges, simply, efficiently, in a single impact, and a man the size of a small building ducked through the frame with a birthday cake in one massive hand. "Harry Potter," the man said cheerfully, shaking drops of rain from his coat. "Last time I saw you, yeah, were just a baby." Harry looked at him with bright, steady eyes. "Hagrid," he said. Hagrid blinked, surprised. "I know about you," Harry continued. "You were the one who brought me to the Dursleys. Dumbledore sent you." Hagrid's expression shifted through surprise, pleasure, and then something complicated. "That's right," he said slowly. "Been keepin' an eye on ya, we have. Dumbledore has been monitoring me from a distance," Harry said evenly. "For 11 years. Without intervention." He looked at Dudley's sleeping form, at Vernon's furious red face, at Petunia who had gone very still and pale in the corner. Without any intervention at all. A beat of silence. Hagrid's expression did something quiet and pained that Harry noted and stored. "Well," Hagrid said, with the gruff warmth of a man who didn't know what to do with complicated things and so moved past them toward simpler ones. Yeah. Here's your Hogwarts letter, Harry." Harry took it. He read it twice. Then he looked up and said, "Tell me everything." He had the death note in the inside pocket of a jacket, his one jacket, Dudley's old one, for sizes too large, when he walked into Diagon Alley for the first time, and the world cracked open. He'd been expecting something. He hadn't been expecting this. Diagon Alley was extraordinary in the way that things are extraordinary when they are entirely, casually, fundamentally different from everything you've ever known. Not different the way a nice neighborhood is different from a bad one, different the way a foreign country is different, with its own physics of existence, its own social grammar, its own vocabulary of want and value. Cauldrons. Owls. Robes in shop windows. The smell of something ancient and brass and parchment that Harry had no word for. People in cloaks moving past each other with the businesslike ease of people who had always lived like this and couldn't imagine otherwise. Harry walked through it and absorbed it and said very little. What he was doing, which Hagrid misread as overwhelmed wonder, was the same thing he always did, cataloging. He was mapping the power structure of a new world in real time, and what he was finding was familiar. Different in texture and vocabulary, identical in architecture. There was old money and new money, identifiable by the ease with which people occupied the expensive shops versus the cautious way they lingered at windows. There were hierarchies of blood that he could already read in the way certain people's eyes moved over certain other people. There was a government, the Ministry of Magic, Hagrid mentioned it twice in passing without elaboration, that apparently managed all of this. And there was a name that kept recurring, spoken in dropped voices and glanced over shoulder tones, you know who. The Dark Lord. Voldemort. Harry filed all of it. He bought his school things with Hagrid's cheerful guidance and his own quiet efficiency. When they went to Gringotts, he watched the goblins with careful respect and noted that they seemed to have a working relationship with the wizarding world built on mutual usefulness and mutual distrust, which he found considerably more honest than most human power arrangements. At Ollivander's, he tried wand after wand in the peculiar way that wand makers apparently worked, the wand choosing the wizard, until a wand of holly and phoenix feather trembled in his hand and sent a shower of red and gold sparks toward the ceiling. Ollivander looked at him in a way that Harry recognized, the way adults looked when they expected one thing and found another. "Curious," Ollivander murmured, measuring him with pale eyes. Very curious. What is? Harry asked, not because he didn't have a guess, but because he wanted to hear how Ollivander phrased it. The phoenix whose tail feather resides in your wand, Ollivander said, gave only one other feather. Only one. That wand, well. You know what it means to be marked, Mr. Potter. I wonder, he paused, head tilted. I wonder what you will make of being marked. Harry held the wand in his steady hand and thought about the death note in his inside pocket. Something worth being marked for, he said. Ollivander smiled, though it didn't reach those pale eyes. Just so, he said softly. Just so. Platform 9 3/4 was the first time Harry was surrounded, densely and inescapably, by children his own age who knew who he was. He'd read about fame in a distant, preparatory way, he'd known, from Hagrid's reaction and the whispers in Diagon Alley, that his name meant something in this world that it hadn't in the Dursleys. He'd sat with this knowledge and decided that it was a variable to be managed. It was data. It was not, under any circumstances, going to make him stupid. The first person on the train was a boy with red hair and something on his nose that might have been a smudge of dirt and might have been the remnant of something more interesting. He burst into the compartment Harry had chosen, a window seat at the rear of a carriage, chosen specifically because it gave a view of both the corridor and the platform, with the easy confidence of someone who'd been on the Hogwarts Express enough times vicariously to feel he already owned it. Everywhere else is full, the boy announced. I'm Ron. Ron Weasley. There was a slight upward inflection at the end of his name, the kind that people unconsciously apply to a name they're checking for recognition. Harry Potter, Harry said. He watched Ron's face go through the sequence, surprise, then a particular kind of excitement, and then held out his hand. Sit down, Ron. Ron sat, and promptly tried to show Harry a spell that turned one of his rats yellow, which didn't work, and then talked for approximately 40 minutes about Hogwarts, Quidditch, the houses, his brothers, his family's lack of money, this stated with a kind of preemptive defiance, as though he expected Harry to care, the general legend of Harry Potter, and then caught himself and went red and said, sorry. You must get that all the time. Not yet, Harry said. I grew up with muggles. Tell me about the houses. Ron was delighted to. Harry listened with his full attention, which Ron, who was clearly accustomed to being the one talking and occasionally the one listened to, not the one with someone's full attention, found slightly unnerving and ultimately enormously gratifying. Harry asked questions. Specific ones. Ron answered them, and Harry catalogued everything, the social weight of the houses, the assumption that Gryffindor was heroic and Slytherin was dangerous, the class dynamics at play and the ease with which Ron said, you'd never want to be in Slytherin, as though it were self-evident. He did not tell Ron that the Sorting Hat was going to have an argument with him. The bushy-haired girl appeared in the compartment doorway around midday, checking for a toad belonging to a round-faced boy standing miserably behind her. Harry looked at her, the quick, assessing way her eyes moved around the compartment, the set of her jaw, the way she'd already memorized something from a textbook she was holding, and shifted so there was room. I'm Hermione Granger, she said briskly. Have you seen a toad? No, Harry said. That's Neville's toad. Trevor, the round-faced boy behind her confirmed. He looked like someone who'd already had a difficult day and was fairly confident the day intended to continue. He'll be in the corridor 3 cars back, Harry said. There's a draft under the exterior door. Warm spot for a toad. Hermione stared at him. How did you? I noticed the draft when I walked through. Sit down if you want, both of you. Neville, your toad is fine. Neville Longbottom sat down with the relieved slump of someone who'd been waiting for permission to stop being anxious. Hermione sat with the precise, upright positioning of someone who had been told that good posture was important and had elected to agree with this assessment. She was already looking at Harry in a way he recognized, the way he looked at problems. Interesting, she was thinking. He could see it in the angle of her head. This one is interesting. You're Harry Potter, she said. Not with Ron's excited rush. Measured, like she was filing it. I've read quite a lot about you. Though I imagine most of it is probably inaccurate. All of it, Harry said. The interesting version hasn't been written yet. Hermione looked at him for a long moment. Then she laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, the kind that nobody performs. It transformed her face entirely. Neville smiled at the floor, the way people smile when they witness something warm happening and don't want to draw attention to noticing. What have you read? Harry asked Hermione, and she launched into it, and for the first time in Harry's memory, a conversation felt like exactly the right size for the space it occupied. The castle was everything and nothing like what Harry had expected. He'd imagined something grand. Hogwarts was beyond grand, it was ancient, and there is a difference. Grand things impress. Ancient things remind. The castle reminded Harry, at every turn, that he was walking through something that had been here long before him and would be here long after, that had absorbed centuries of children arriving just as he was arriving, nervous and certain and wrong about things they didn't yet know they were wrong about. Harry walked through it and felt, for the first time in his life, that he was in the right place. Not a comfortable place. Not a safe place. The right one. The sorting was in the Great Hall, which was enormous and candlelit and honestly a bit much, which Harry suspected was entirely intentional. He stood in the line of first years and watched the other children's faces as they looked up, the awe, the nerves, the performance of casualness from the ones who'd grown up knowing about this and felt they should be too cool to gape. Draco Malfoy was 3 people ahead of Harry in the line and was managing the too cool to gape expression with the practiced ease of someone who'd been rehearsing it. Harry looked at Draco and noted, money, certainly. The particular kind of assurance that comes from being told, very consistently, from birth, that the world is arranged for your benefit. Handsome in the fine-boned way of a family that had kept its bloodline narrow. And underneath all of it, something that Harry recognized from looking in mirrors, a calculation. Draco Malfoy was always measuring, always positioning, always deciding how this moment reflected on him. The difference between them, Harry thought, was that Harry was calculating about things that mattered. The sorting hat went on Draco's head and said, Slytherin, before it touched his hair. Harry stepped forward when his name was called to a hall that went completely, totally silent, a silence with texture and weight, the silence of a room full of people breathing in at the same time. He sat on the stool. Professor McGonagall placed the hat on his head. The hat was sentient in a way that was immediately and completely apparent. It wasn't like a voice in his head, it was more like a sudden, close presence, as though something ancient had pulled up a chair. Well, said the hat. Harry Potter. Hello, Harry thought back. A pause. The hat was doing something, sifting, reaching into the layers of him. Harry felt it and let it, curious. Slytherin, the hat said, after a moment. Without question. The ambition alone, and the cunning, the long view, the patience, this is rare in someone your age, Mr. Potter. Truly rare. But, Harry thought. But you feel it too, the hat agreed. Slytherin won't serve your purpose. Not because you don't belong there intellectually, but because you need a different vantage point. Slytherin is inside the power structure. You intend to dismantle it. Yes, Harry thought. Gryffindor, then. The courage to do what you've decided is worth doing. The visibility you'll need. The platform. Does it matter which house I'm in? Harry thought. More than you know yet, said the hat. Less than you're afraid of. Houses are tools, Mr. Potter. You understand tools. Yes, Harry thought. I do. The hat paused one final time, as though genuinely reluctant. Then, Gryffindor, it shouted, and the table on the left erupted. Harry took the hat off, handed it back to McGonagall, and walked to the Gryffindor table while the cheering washed over him. He sat down next to Hermione, who had been sorted 5 names before him. She had her hands flat on the table, containing her excitement with the focused effort of someone who considered excitement somewhat undignified. "Thought it might be Slytherin," she said quietly, under the noise. Harry looked at her. "What made you think that?" "The way you listen," she said. "People who listen like that are usually very ambitious about something." Harry picked up his fork as the plates filled with food. "I am," he said simply. Across the table, Ron was already eating with the total commitment of someone who had been on a train for 7 hours. Neville was staring at his pudding with the cautious joy of someone who'd had a difficult day and was now tentatively willing to believe it had turned out all right. Harry looked up the table to where the professors sat, moving his eyes systematically along the high table. Dumbledore at the center, old, deliberate, wearing robes the color of deep water with stars that actually moved. He was watching Harry with the particular quality of attention that adults use when they're trying to look like they're not watching. Beside him, a thin man with greasy hair and black eyes who was watching Harry with open, unconcealed intensity, something in that gaze that was complex and dark and old. Harry looked directly at the greasy-haired man without blinking. The man's expression flickered, surprise at being met directly. Then it shuddered. "Severus Snape," Harry filed. "Issue there. Probably about my father. Deal with it when it becomes a problem." He ate his dinner. The death note was in his trunk, under his clothes, wrapped in a shirt. He'd thought carefully about where to keep it, close enough to be secure, not so close as to invite questions. He'd thought about everything carefully. At Gryffindor Tower that night, while Ron was already snoring and Neville was still awake in the quiet way of someone running their day back through their head, Harry lay on his back in the four-poster bed and stared at the canopy. He thought about what Ollivander had said. "What will you make of being marked?" He thought about the death note in his trunk, wrapped in his shirt, waiting. He thought about all the names he didn't know yet, in a world that was larger and more broken than he'd had vocabulary for before today. The thing about being marked, Harry thought, was that it meant people already expected something from you. They expected a type, the destined hero, shaped by prophecy, polished into something convenient and displayable. He had never been interested in being that. He thought about the death note. He thought about the Ministry of Magic, which he'd read about now in everything from Hagrid's offhand comments to a history of magic to 3 issues of the Daily Prophet he'd read on the train. A ministry that had let Death Eaters walk free. That had, by all accounts, forced children into situations that permanently damaged them while powerful men made comfortable decisions in offices. He thought about Neville Longbottom, whose parents were at St. Mungo's because of what people in this world had been allowed to do. He thought about every name he didn't know yet. Every consequence of a system that had decided, very calmly, that some lives were worth less than others. He was 11. He had time. But not unlimited time. And not unlimited patience. Soon, he thought. And in the dark of his trunk, under the shirt, the death note sat and waited, the way tools wait for the moment they become necessary. Chapter 2, The boy who chose. The first thing Harry did on his first full morning at Hogwarts was wake up before everyone else. Not by accident. He'd been setting himself to wake at 5:30 since he was 8 years old, back when the Dursleys had decided that Harry should be the one to start breakfast before anyone else was up. They'd taken his alarm clock after the second week because the sound annoyed Vernon. Harry had simply trained himself. The body, he'd found, was a reasonably cooperative instrument if you were consistent with it. He dressed in the dark, took his wand from the nightstand, and went out. The Gryffindor common room was empty at 5:30 in the morning, which was exactly what he wanted. He sat in the chair nearest the fire, it had burned down to deep orange coals overnight, still radiating heat, and spread his copy of A History of Magic across his knees. He'd bought 2 copies in Diagon Alley. One for classes. One that he'd been annotating since the train, filling the margins with questions, cross-references, things that didn't quite add up. The Ministry of Magic had been founded in 1707. Before that, there had been the Wizards' Council, which had governed with considerably more visible corruption and considerably less pretense of doing otherwise. The ministry's founding was presented in the textbook as straightforwardly progressive, a modernization, a rationalization of wizarding society. Harry read this with his pencil between his teeth and thought about all the revolutions he'd studied that had described themselves the same way. Who wrote this book, he noted in the margin. Bathilda Bagshot. Check her other sources. Find who funded her research. He worked through an hour of reading, making notes, and was deeply absorbed in a footnote about the 1792 Wisengamot restructuring when the portrait hole opened and Hermione Granger came through it wearing her robes already fully buttoned, carrying 3 textbooks and looking only slightly surprised to find someone already there. She stopped when she saw him. Looked at the annotated textbook on his knee. Then she sat down in the chair across from him without being asked, opened her own copy of A History of Magic, and said, "What are you finding?" Harry looked up. The ministry's founding document included a clause that gave the minister extraordinary powers in times of exceptional threat. It's never been repealed. It's been used 11 times. I know, Hermione said immediately, then paused as though she hadn't meant to say it quite that quickly. I mean, I noticed that too. The clause. Bagshot doesn't really analyze it, she just states it. Because she doesn't think it needs analysis, Harry said. It's presented as a safeguard. It's not worded as a safeguard, Hermione said, and for a moment they looked at each other with the precise recognition of 2 people who have been thinking similar things in isolation and have unexpectedly found company. It's worded as a blank check with a low threshold. What counts as exceptional? Harry said. Apparently whatever the minister decides counts, Hermione said, and there was something in her voice, an edge under the precision, something personal and frustrated that she'd been carrying for a while. Harry filed it. Tell me what you know about the ministry, he said. Tell me what you know first, she said, with the reflexive intellectual competitiveness of someone who'd been the smartest person in every room they'd ever occupied and wanted data before they committed to a position. Harry almost smiled. Fair enough, he said, and they went back and forth for the next 40 minutes, and it was the best conversation Harry had had in his life up to that point, which was not a high bar but was nonetheless true. Classes were interesting in the way that things are interesting when you already understand the shape of them and are now filling in the specifics. Harry had expected magic to feel like something he was learning. Instead it felt like something he was remembering, not in a mystical sense, but in the sense that his accidental magic over the years had already given him a physical grammar for it. When Professor Flitwick explained the mechanics of the Wingardium Leviosa charm and demonstrated the wrist movement, Harry had already done the motion before the professor finished the sentence, without quite meaning to. The feather on his desk lifted cleanly and hovered at eye level. Flitwick blinked at it. Then at Harry. Excellent, Mr. Potter. Excellent, wrist and arm, everyone, just like. Harry set the feather back down and watched the rest of the class. Ron was swishing his wand with more enthusiasm than precision. Neville, 3 rows back, had his eyes closed with the concentration of someone expecting to fail. Hermione, 1 seat to Harry's left, had her feather in the air 12 seconds after Harry's, her expression fierce with satisfaction. The class Neville looked least miserable in was herbology, which was the class most people seemed to care least about. Harry had noticed this on the first day, the way certain subjects were treated as more serious than others, the clear hierarchy of prestige in which transfiguration and potions sat at the top and herbology and astronomy were considered secondary. He thought this was interesting because herbology, from what he'd read, was foundational to about 60% of practical magic. After their second herbology class, he fell into step beside Neville on the path back up to the castle and said, "You're good at this." Neville looked at him with the expression of someone who'd been handed something and wasn't sure whether to hold it or drop it. "It's just plants," he said. "Magical plants," Harry said. "That can heal, poison, create, or destroy depending on preparation. There's a whole section in the library on wartime use of magical botany." "The venomous tentacula alone can, I know," Neville said, and there it was, not the shy mumble but something underneath it, something that had been waiting for someone to use the right key. "The mandrake is used for petrification cures, and if you dry and powder the root at the wrong stage you get something that induces permanent memory loss, and there are 17 subspecies of devil's snare with different light tolerances and, he stopped. Looked at Harry carefully. Sorry. Don't apologize, Harry said. That's called knowing things. Neville walked for a moment in silence. Then, people usually don't, I mean, it's not, Neville, Harry said, easily. What happened to your parents? It wasn't gentle, exactly. But it wasn't cruel. It was direct in the way that Harry was direct about everything, because Harry believed that the thing people needed most was usually the thing being most carefully avoided. Neville stopped walking. Harry stopped with him. I know what happened, Harry said quietly. I'm not asking you to explain it. I'm telling you that I know, and that it's the reason you already understand what most of our year doesn't, that there are people in this world who will hurt you, or the people you love, without hesitation, and that understanding how things work is the closest thing to armor that actually exists. Neville was very still. There was something happening in his face, something shifting, like ice cracking not to break but to let water move. The Longbottoms, Harry said. Frank and Alice. Aurors. Tortured into insanity by people who walked away from it. 4 of them, Neville said, and his voice was completely steady in a way that meant he'd said this name in his head so many times it had gone past pain into something structural. The Lestranges and Barty Crouch Jr. Crouch Jr. is in Azkaban, Harry said. The Lestranges are in Azkaban. He paused. For now. Neville looked at him sharply. Azkaban held, Harry said neutrally, until it didn't. Systems fail. Particularly ones built on a single point of failure, in this case, the Dementors. But that's a separate conversation. He looked at Neville steadily. You deserve to be here. You're not here because someone felt sorry for you. You're here because you know more about the foundations of this world than most people who'll be at the top of our year by 5th year. Remember that. They walked the rest of the way to the castle in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Something had settled in Neville that hadn't been settled before. He walked a little differently. Barely noticeable. Harry noticed. Potions was the class where things went predictably sideways, and it went sideways in the precise direction Harry had anticipated from the first moment he'd seen Severus Snape at the high table. The dungeon classroom was cold and smelled of things that had been preserved in ways that preservation was not designed for. Snape entered without ceremony, robes moving the way robes move when the person wearing them has cultivated the effect over time, and stood at the front of the class with the particular stillness of someone who expected attention and received it. You are here to learn the subtle science and exact art of potion making, he began, and his voice was exactly calibrated, low enough that the back of the room had to lean in slightly to hear it, which was, Harry thought, entirely intentional. I can teach you how to bewitch the mind and ensnare the senses. I can tell you how to bottle fame, brew glory, and even put a stopper in death. A pause, deliberate. Then again, perhaps some of you have come to Hogwarts in possession of abilities so great that instruction is a formality. His eyes moved to Harry. Harry met them. This was apparently not the response Snape expected, or rather, not the texture of response he expected. He'd expected some variant of flustered celebrity self-consciousness. Harry looked back at him the way Harry looked at most things, calmly, attentively, with the expression of someone taking notes. Potter, Snape said. What would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood? Draught of living death, Harry said. A powerful sleeping potion. The asphodel, from the lily family, combined with wormwood in the right ratio creates a sedative effect strong enough to simulate death at the correct dose. You'd also want powdered root rather than fresh because the moisture content in fresh root throws the concentration off by approximately 20%. Silence. Snape's expression did something very controlled. Where did you read that? Most patenti potions, Harry said, in the restricted section. And advanced potion making, which isn't restricted but is usually considered third-year material. I had time over the summer. Hermione, 3 seats to his left, was staring at him with an expression that was equal parts delighted and slightly indignant that she hadn't thought to read most Patendi potions first. Where would you look, Snape continued, his voice still controlled but with a new quality in it, not warmth, something more complicated and more guarded, if I told you to find a bezoar. Stomach of a goat, Harry said. Though the potency varies by breed. Cashmere goats produce the most effective bezoars, historically, because their stomach acid composition. I didn't ask for a dissertation on goat gastronomy, Potter. You asked where I'd look, Harry said. I'm telling you what I'd look for. There was a particular quality of silence in a classroom when 30 children are collectively deciding whether something is impressive or catastrophic and haven't quite landed yet. Snape looked at Harry for a long, measuring moment. Harry looked back. He doesn't know what to do with me, Harry noted. He expected either arrogance or nerves. Neither is useful to him. He'll recalibrate. Write me 2 feet on the properties of monkshood, Snape said, turning away, for next lesson. All of you. The class exhaled. Ron, leaning close from the next seat, whispered, Blimey. He telegraphed the questions, Harry said quietly. Classic intimidation structure. Start with something the celebrity student probably doesn't know, establish dominance in front of the class. I just happen to know the answers. Ron stared at him. How did you know he was going to do that? Harry looked at him. People in authority who feel threatened always establish dominance first. It's very predictable. Ron opened his mouth, found nothing adequate, and closed it again. Then, can I copy your monkshood essay? No, Harry said. But I'll explain the properties if you want, and you can write it yourself. Ron weighed this. Yeah, all right, he said. That's fair, I suppose. The first week dissolved into the rhythm of the castle the way first weeks do, the novelty wearing down enough that the actual architecture of daily life became visible underneath it. Harry mapped the castle systematically, both in the literal sense, he had a growing hand-drawn floor plan in the back of his private notebook, and in the social sense. The social map was more interesting. Gryffindor and Slytherin had an adversarial relationship that had been so thoroughly institutionalized that most students on both sides didn't experience it as a choice anymore, just as a fact of life, like weather. Harry found this fascinating and slightly worrying. Draco Malfoy occupied the center of the Slytherin first-year cohort with the ease of someone who had always occupied centers of things, 2 large boys flanking him, Crabbe and Goyle, who were physically imposing and intellectually uninterested in most things that didn't involve eating. Alongside Draco, a sharp-faced girl named Pansy Parkinson who laughed at everything Draco said and was clearly considerably cleverer than she allowed herself to appear in his company. Draco had approached Harry on the train. Harry hadn't mentioned this to Ron, though Ron had mentioned Draco in cautionary terms several times, and had extended something that was framed as an offer of alliance but was structured as an invitation to a subordinate position. Harry had declined in terms so pleasant and final that Draco hadn't quite realized he'd been refused until the conversation was already over. In the corridor outside Transfiguration on Thursday of the first week, Draco appeared with Crabbe and Goyle behind him and a smile that hadn't quite forgiven. Potter, he said. I wanted to ask, how are you finding things? It must be very strange, coming from the Muggle world. Not knowing anything. I know quite a lot, Harry said pleasantly. Is there something specific I can help you with? The smile thinned. I meant the wizarding world. Obviously. I've been here a week, Harry said. What I've found is that it's structurally very similar to the Muggle world. The names are different. The prejudices are more formally organized. He tilted his head slightly. The Malfoy family have been in Britain for how long? Since the Norman conquest, if I'm remembering a history of magic correctly. Your ancestor Armand Malfoy came over with William the Conqueror. Did well for himself by cooperating with whoever was in power at the time. Draco's face had gone through several colors. That's not history, Harry said. It's just history. Fascinating family, yours. Very adaptive. He smiled, and it reached his eyes in the way that Draco, who was actually quite perceptive, found more unsettling than if it hadn't. Was there something else? Crabbe and Goyle looked at each other. Draco looked at Harry for a long moment, recalibrating the way Snape had recalibrated, and said nothing, and walked away. In his wake, Ron, who'd been standing slightly behind Harry with the expression of someone braced for a fight who'd watched it fail to materialize, let out a long breath. That was, how did you? He wanted me to be either intimidated or defensive, Harry said, walking toward Transfiguration. Neither is useful. History is just true. You can't argue with true. You memorized his family history? I memorized a lot of family histories, Harry said. The ones in A History of Magic. The ones in Hogwarts, A History. It seemed like relevant background. He pushed the classroom door open. Good morning, Professor. McGonagall, who had been sorting parchment at the front of the room, looked up with the expression she seemed to reserve for Harry, somewhere between approval and the particular wariness of a chess player who's recognized that something on the board is not what it appeared to be. Mr. Potter. You're early. I prefer early, Harry said. Yes, McGonagall said, and something in her voice suggested she was filing this. I imagine you do. The letter from Dumbledore came on a Sunday 3 weeks into term, delivered by a school owl that found Harry in the library, where he was sitting between Hermione and an empty chair that had a pile of books on it that Hermione had claimed and then abandoned to go find more books. The note was brief. My office, at your convenience this afternoon. 4th floor, behind the gargoyle. The password is sherbet lemon. A.D. Harry read it twice. Folded it. Put it in his pocket. He went at 3 o'clock, which was his genuine convenience, and also sent a message, which was that he was not rushing. The headmaster's office was extraordinary, circular, spiraling upward, crammed with instruments that whirred and clicked and measured things Harry didn't yet have names for, portraits of previous headmasters sleeping or pretending to sleep along the walls. A large red bird on a perch that Harry recognized as a phoenix, which looked at him with calm golden eyes and made a low, complex sound that was not quite a cry and not quite a melody. Dumbledore was behind his desk, and he looked, in person and close, considerably more layered than he had at the sorting. The benign grandeur was real, it wasn't performance, or wasn't only performance, but underneath it Harry could see the infrastructure of a man who had been carrying an enormous number of decisions for a very long time. He was old in the way that mountains are old, the kind of old that has its own gravity. Harry, he said warmly. Please, sit down. Lemon drop? No, thank you, Harry said, sitting. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. You wanted to see me. I wanted to speak with you, yes. Dumbledore's blue eyes were sharp under the benign warmth, measuring in the way that Harry's eyes were measuring. They measured each other for a moment, not unpleasantly. I've been hearing interesting things from your professors. Good interesting or bad interesting? Fascinating interesting, Dumbledore said. Which is rarer? He folded his hands. Professor Flitwick tells me your charm work is 2 years ahead of curriculum. Professor Snape tells me, and here something flickered in Dumbledore's expression, that you are either very well prepared or very unusual. Professor McGonagall, who is not given to overstatement, told me that watching you in class is like watching someone relearn something they already know. Which is a rather specific observation. I read a lot, Harry said. Yes, Dumbledore said. That is evident. A pause, and the blue eyes became somewhat less warm and somewhat more precise. Harry. I want to speak to you about your childhood. All right, Harry said. Your aunt and uncle were not kind, Harry said evenly. I know you know that. You've been monitoring the situation for 11 years. I know that too. He kept his voice neutral because he'd decided, before coming here, that anger was not the tool for this conversation. I'm not here to discuss the Dursleys. I assume you had reasons, however inadequate, for the arrangement. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face, genuine, Harry thought, not performed. Harry. I owe you more than an explanation. I owe you an apology. Yes, Harry said simply. Another moment of quiet. Dumbledore seemed to be recalibrating in the same way the others had, but more carefully and more thoroughly, because Dumbledore was considerably more experienced at recognizing when he was dealing with something unusual. You are not, he said finally, what I expected. What did you expect? Someone, shaping, Dumbledore said, with an honesty that Harry found he respected more than he wanted to. Someone who arrived here needing to understand who they were. Someone I could guide. You can still guide me, Harry said. On things where your knowledge is relevant and your interests align with mine. He met Dumbledore's eyes. I'm not here to be your weapon, Professor. I'm not here to be the prophecy's solution. I'm here because I have a great deal I want to learn, and this is the best place to learn it. And what, Dumbledore said, very quietly, do you intend to do with what you learn? Harry looked at him. Thought about the death note in his trunk. Thought about the Lestranges in Azkaban and the question of whether Azkaban would hold. Thought about the Ministry and its Extraordinary Powers Clause. Thought about Frank and Alice Longbottom at St. Mungo's, and the men who'd put them there, and the system that had let those men exist. Fix things, he said. Specifically and permanently. Dumbledore looked at him for a very long time. The office ticked and whirred around them, and the Phoenix watched Harry with its golden eyes, and outside the window the Scottish Highlands were going gold and red in the autumn afternoon. I see, Dumbledore said at last. And then, more quietly, I wonder if you know how dangerous those words are. I know exactly how dangerous they are, Harry said. That's rather the point. He left the office at 3:45. On the way back to Gryffindor Tower, he stopped at the library, returned the books Hermione had left in the pile, and picked up 2 new ones, Wizarding Law, A Practical History, and the Wisengamot, Structure, Power, and Precedent. He had a great deal to learn. Halloween arrived with the specificity of weather in Scotland, sideways and committed. The great hall was decorated with floating jack-o'-lanterns and the smell of something cinnamon and warm, and the feast was extravagant enough that even the Gryffindors who'd been complaining about workload all week went quiet in the presence of it. Harry ate and watched and listened to the easy noise of a hall full of children who were, most of them, having the time of their lives. He noticed Quirrell leaving early. He noticed because he noticed most things, but also because Quirrell had a habit of leaving early. Harry had catalogued it over the first weeks without quite having a use for the data yet. Tonight was different, though. The way Quirrell moved through the hall door was not the usual fluttery nervous exit. He moved with purpose. With direction. Harry set down his fork. Ron was in the middle of explaining a Quidditch strategy to Neville, who was listening with the polite attention of someone who didn't particularly follow Quidditch but liked being talked to. Hermione was 3 seats away reading under the table in a way she apparently believed was subtle. Harry waited 3 minutes. Then he said, casually, to Ron, I'll be back, and went out. The corridors were empty in the way of corridors during a feast, that particular school evening quiet that felt borrowed, like a held breath. Harry moved quickly, following something between instinct and the accumulated data of a month of observation. Quirrell had been heading toward the 3rd-floor corridor, which was forbidden and which Harry had therefore comprehensively mapped in his second week. He was halfway down the 2nd-floor corridor when he heard it, a distant crash, a grinding stone sound, and then, rising up through the castle's own noise like something surfacing, screaming. A girl's voice. He ran. The girls' bathroom on the 2nd floor had a troll in it. This was not a sentence Harry had expected to think, ever, but here it was, solid and concrete and approximately 12 feet of solid muscle and blunt, enthusiastic destructive energy, swinging a club in a space entirely too small for a 12-foot troll. Hermione was in the corner. Harry realized this with a particular clarity, that Hermione had left the feast early, and that no one had gone looking for her, and that she'd been here alone. He also realized he had about 4 seconds before the club came down on the cubicle Hermione was currently inside. He didn't think about it. Thinking was for situations where you had time. He pulled his wand, pointed it at the Trolls Club hand, and said, "Accio," hard and sharp, the incantation cutting through the noise like something physical. He was a first year. The summoning charm was fourth-year curriculum. The club jolted in the Troll's grip, didn't fly to Harry's hand, because he hadn't the mass management for that yet, but it disrupted the swing, sending the blow sideways into the wall rather than the cubicle, and the Troll swung around toward the new disruption with all the focused intelligence of something that operated entirely on the level of direction and force. Harry stepped sideways, already moving, already thinking 3 beats ahead. He needed to redirect its attention. He needed to give Hermione space to move. He needed to. Ron appeared in the bathroom doorway, panting, with the expression of someone who'd followed without a plan and was now deeply committed to improvising. "Distract it," Harry said. "Other side, go left." Ron went left with no hesitation, wand out, Wingardium Leviosa aimed at the Trolls Club, and this time it worked, the club rising smoothly from the Troll's grip and swinging upward toward the ceiling, which was where it connected with the back of the Troll's head on its way down. The Troll sat. Then it fell. The bathroom shook. Silence, except for the dripping of a broken pipe and Hermione's audible breathing from inside the furthest cubicle. Harry walked over, pulled open the cubicle door. Hermione was standing against the back wall, both hands flat against the tiles, her robes dusty, her face white. She looked at Harry. Then at Ron in the doorway. Then at the Troll. "It's unconscious," Harry said. "You're fine." "I know I'm fine," Hermione said, with a steadiness that Harry thought took considerable effort, and came out the cubicle. She looked at the Troll again. Her hands were shaking slightly. She put them in her pockets. "How did you, the Accio?" "I needed something to work," Harry said simply. Hermione looked at him with that particular look, the one that had started appearing in the first week and kept intensifying. "This doesn't add up yet, but I'm going to keep the data look." Behind them, the sound of running footsteps, and then McGonagall arrived with Snape and Quirrell at her heels, and the scene arranged itself the way scenes do when authority arrives after the fact, into questions and explanations and the slow construction of an official account. Later, when the story had been told and the teachers had gone and they were walking back to Gryffindor Tower, Hermione said quietly, "You came looking for me." "I noticed you'd left," Harry said. "Ron did too," Ron said. "I mean, we both," Harry said, "and we went, thank you," Hermione said simply. She walked in silence for a moment. Then, "I'll do better next time." "I know," Harry said. About not being alone in a bathroom during a troll attack, specifically, she said, and it had a dry edge to it, which was the closest Hermione got to a joke, and Ron laughed, and even Harry smiled. From that evening onward, there were 3 of them. Not because of sentiment, though sentiment was part of it. Because Harry had identified, with his usual clarity, that Hermione Granger was the sharpest mind he'd met in his 11 years and that Ron Weasley had the loyalty and the reflexive, unthinking courage of someone who hadn't yet learned to calculate risk, which in certain situations was the most valuable thing in the world. He needed both of those things. He valued both of those people. These were not mutually exclusive positions. December arrived and Quidditch happened. Harry had not been particularly interested in Quidditch as a concept, moving balls, moving people, the elaborate scoring system, the complicated rules, but Professor McGonagall had watched him produce a perfect hover charm in her first class and had sent him a note before October ended, and the note had said, "Seeker. First year. Don't tell anyone yet." Flying, it turned out, was the one thing Harry did not approach analytically. The first time he was on a broom, the school's brooms, which were old and temperamental and listed slightly to the left, something in him simply knew it. The way the air worked. The way the broom responded to the shift in his weight before he'd consciously shifted it, the way the ground dropped away and the sky came up and everything that was not the broom and the horizon fell away, and Harry realized, hanging 300 feet above the Hogwarts grounds in the cold November air, that there was exactly one thing in his life that existed purely for itself, without calculation or purpose or utility. He was the best flyer anyone at Hogwarts had seen in a generation. He knew this not from being told but from the way the older students on the Quidditch pitch stopped what they were doing when he practiced, and the way Wood, the Gryffindor captain, watched with an expression of a man who had been given an unexpected gift and couldn't quite trust it. He played his first match in November, and the match produced an incident that ran through the school for a week. A bludger had apparently gone rogue, and Harry's broom had begun jerking and veering in ways that had nothing to do with wind, and Harry had managed the situation with total, unhurried calm until the snitch was in his hand and the match was over. In the stands, Harry had looked up at the high table as he caught the snitch, and his eyes had found Snape, who had been muttering something with his eyes on Harry's broom and his hand under the table. And just behind Snape, Quirrell, with his hand extended in a different direction. Harry filed it. He shook Wood's hand and smiled at the team's celebration and went back to the changing rooms and sat quietly in the corner thinking about which of the two it had been, and whether the other one had been trying to stop the first, and what that told him about the architecture of what was actually happening in this castle. Later, he'd mention it to Hermione, who would go pale and furious and say, "Someone tried to kill you," in a voice that was both outraged and personally affronted, as though Harry's safety was a problem she'd been handed and intended to solve. "Tried to throw me," Harry said. "Killing would have been incidental. That's not comforting." It wasn't meant to be comforting. It was meant to be accurate. He looked at her. "Quirrell." Hermione stared at him. "Professor Quirrell." "The counter-jinx interrupted it," Harry said. Someone was jinxing, someone else was countering. Snape was closer. Quirrell had the better angle. He paused. "I need to know what's on the third floor." "It's forbidden," Hermione said. Harry gave her a look. She sighed the sigh of someone who had principles and was in the process of discovering that certain people made those principles considerably more complicated than anticipated. "I'll find out what I can," she said. "I know," Harry said. Christmas came and the castle emptied and Harry stayed. He stayed because the Dursleys were not a reason to go back to Privet Drive when there was a choice, and because an almost empty Hogwarts was, if anything, more useful than a full one. The remaining students were a handful of Gryffindors including Ron, who was staying because his parents were doing something order-related in Romania that Harry had logged for future reference, and 3 Hufflepuffs he didn't know well. On Christmas morning, Harry woke to a pile of presents at the end of his bed that was considerably larger than he'd expected. Ron's family had sent something, and Hermione had sent a book, The Rise and Fall of the Dark Arts, annotated by a previous owner in handwriting that Harry found very interesting, and there was one package that had no label, wrapped in plain brown paper that Harry opened last and carefully. Inside, an invisibility cloak. And a note, in handwriting that was not signed. "Use it well." Harry held the cloak in both hands for a long moment. He thought about who could have sent it, and arrived at a conclusion quickly: it had to be Dumbledore. The unattributed gift, the timing, the object itself, Dumbledore giving him a tool while maintaining deniability. Harry didn't know whether to be grateful or annoyed, and settled on both simultaneously, which he had found was frequently the most accurate response to Dumbledore. He put the cloak on. He went to the library. He went to the restricted section and moved through it systematically and silently, reading by wandlight in the small hours of Christmas morning, and he found 3 things that mattered: a reference to something called the Mirror of Eriste, a ministry disciplinary record from 1982 that had no business being in the restricted section and everything to do with the 11 Death Eaters who'd walked free, and a small, overlooked history of the Philosopher's Stone that told Harry, by the end, almost exactly what was in the third-floor corridor and why it was there. He left the restricted section at 4 in the morning, replaced everything carefully, and went back to Gryffindor Tower. He did not go to the 3rd floor. Not yet. He sat in the common room and opened his private notebook, and wrote for a long time, not in the Death Note, but in his own notes, in his own careful handwriting, constructing the map of a situation that was considerably more urgent than it had appeared. Voldemort, alive but not embodied. Seeking the stone. Using Quirrell. The ministry, meanwhile, occupied with politics and the daily profit and the smooth operation of a system that had already failed catastrophically once and was in the process of failing again. When he was done writing, he sat very still and thought about the death note under his mattress upstairs. He was 11 years old. He had a death note. He had an invisibility cloak. He had the sharpest mind he'd met in his life sitting in the room above this one, and the most instinctively courageous person he'd met sitting 2 rooms further along. He had a great deal to do. Not yet, he told himself. Not this year. The stone would be contained, he had ideas about that. Quirrell would be handled, he had ideas about that too, and they didn't require the death note, not yet, not for a man who was already functionally dying. There were larger targets. There were names he'd found in that ministry file from 1982, men and women who had made choices and escaped consequences, men and women who had shaped the world that had shaped Neville Longbottom and Harry Potter and a dozen other children whose names Harry would never know. Those names, he thought. Those first. He picked up the notebook, his private one, and turned to the page he'd started in the restricted section. The names from the 1982 file. 3 of them: Augustus Rookwood, ministry official, convicted in absentia for passing intelligence to Voldemort, sentence commuted by an unnamed ministry official in 1985. Walden McNair, creature executioner for the ministry, documented to have participated in 3 Muggle killings in 1979, all records sealed. And one name that appeared only as an initial and a notation, BC, cleared, minister's office, 1984, which Harry had a strong feeling about. 3 names. 3 people who had moved through the world without consequence, who had shaped the machinery that ground other people into nothing, who were operating right now within a system that had decided they deserved to keep operating. Harry was 11. But he would not always be 11. He put the notebook away. He picked up The Rise and Fall of the Dark Arts, Hermione's Gift, and read until the fire burned down, and when the light was gone he sat in the dark without moving for a long time, the way he used to sit in the cupboard under the stairs, in the measured dark, building the architecture of what came next. Outside, Hogwarts settled into the deep cold of the Christmas night, and the stars over the mountains were very clear, and somewhere in the castle the instruments in Dumbledore's office clicked and measured things, and the Philosopher's Stone sat in its trap 3 floors above and 1 floor below all at once, and Harry Potter sat in the firelight with his notebook on his knee and thought about justice, which is a different thing from revenge, and about whether he knew yet which one he was building. He was 11. He had time. Chapter 3, Names in the Margins. The ministry file had 12 pages. Harry knew because he'd counted them twice, crouched in the restricted section on Christmas morning with the invisibility cloak pulled around his knees and his wand held steady between his teeth while he used both hands to hold the folder flat against the reading table. The file wasn't shelved, it had been tucked, badly, between 2 larger volumes on Dark Wizard Trials, as though someone had been using it recently and hadn't replaced it properly. Harry had found it by accident, reaching for a volume on Azkaban sentencing records, and had known immediately that it was wrong, the wrong paperweight, the wrong ministry seal embossed at the top, the wrong shade of green for something that belonged in the restricted section of a school library. Someone had hidden it here. Not carefully enough. He'd memorized the key sections in the half hour he had before the castle started to wake, writing nothing down, keeping everything in the part of his memory he used for things that mattered. Names, dates, case numbers, the specific phrasing of the commutation orders, the language that bureaucracies use when they're doing something they know is wrong but have decided to process as if it's administrative. Back in Gryffindor Tower, alone in the common room while everyone slept, he transferred it all to his private notebook. Not the death note. His own. The one with the dark blue cover that he'd bought in Diagon Alley and that lived in the inside pocket of his school robes when he was moving around the castle and under his mattress when he wasn't. 3 names had risen to the surface. He'd written them at the top of a clean page and drawn lines out from each one, the way you build a mind map when you're trying to understand a system rather than just a single point in it. Augustus Rookwood. Unspeakable. Department of Mysteries. Had spent 11 years passing Ministry intelligence directly to Voldemort, floor plans, Auror deployment schedules, the identities of Ministry officials who were secretly working with the Order of the Phoenix. Convicted in absentia in 1982. A Ministry official named Croker had filed a petition citing insufficient evidence of intent in 1985 and the conviction had been quietly set aside. Rookwood was currently employed as a senior researcher in the Department of Mysteries, where his security clearance gave him access to information that Harry didn't yet have the vocabulary to categorize but understood was significant. Walden McNair. Ministry executioner. The documented killings from 1979 were the ones that had made it into the file, the ones Harry had found. He had a feeling the actual number was higher. The 1979 records had been sealed under the secrecy provision by a minister whose name had been redacted, which was interesting because ministerial use of the secrecy provision required a second signature from the Wisengamot, which meant someone on the Wisengamot had agreed to seal those records. McNair was currently employed by the Committee for the Disposal of Dangerous Creatures, which gave him legitimate access to dangerous things and the institutional cover to use them. BC. The initials. The notation, cleared, Minister's Office, 1984. Harry had a theory about BC that he wasn't ready to commit to yet. The theory made him careful and cold in equal measure, and carefulness was useful and coldness was dangerous when it became its own end, so he kept the theory on a separate page and didn't look at it too often. He dated the page, closed the notebook, and went to bed. He slept 7 hours and woke up with the clarity of someone who had made a decision and was ready to begin working on it. The problem with acting in his first year was scope. Harry understood his own limitations with the kind of clear-eyed honesty that most 11-year-olds hadn't been forced into, but he had been, and it was occasionally useful. He was ahead of his year in almost every subject. He was not ahead of a trained adult wizard. He had a death note that could kill anyone whose face he could hold clearly in his mind, but using it without understanding the full downstream consequences was exactly the kind of recklessness he'd spent 2 years at Privet Drive teaching himself not to commit. So he spent the spring term of his first year doing 3 things simultaneously. He learned everything the curriculum offered and then went past it, working through 3rd and 4th year texts in the evenings in the library with Hermione, who had discovered that Harry's reading pace matched hers and found this both vindicating and slightly competitive, which was good for both of them. He deepened his understanding of the Death Note's full capabilities, spending his late nights in quiet conversation with Ryuk, who appeared when Harry had questions and had begun to bring apples in the way that a person might bring a reference book to a meeting, something to occupy the hands while the mind worked. And he kept watching. Watching Quirrell, who by February was sweating visibly in the corridors, moving through the castle with the urgent distraction of someone conducting a search. Watching Snape, who was conducting a different kind of surveillance. Harry could track Snape's attention moving across the chessboard of the castle's power relationships with something that wasn't quite suspicion and wasn't quite protectiveness and was probably, Harry thought, a complicated version of both. Watching the 3rd floor corridor, which he'd been inside twice under the invisibility cloak and had comprehensively mapped, the Cerberus, the traps below it, the stone at the end. It's a trap, he told Hermione, in the library on a Tuesday in February. Not just for whoever's trying to steal it. The whole arrangement. Hermione looked up from intermediate transfiguration. Explain. The traps are designed to be solvable, Harry said. Individually. In sequence. By Hogwarts students. Fluffy, falls asleep with music, that's a direct reference to something any student who'd read about magical creatures would know. The Devil's Snare, relaxing stops it, basic herbology. The chess set, playable. The logic puzzle at the end, according to what I've read, uses potions that a student with decent potion knowledge could work out. He looked at her. It's not a professional security installation. It's a gauntlet. Specifically designed for someone who's good at school subjects. Hermione stared at him. He watched her work through it, her eyes doing that rapid flicking thing they did when she was cross-referencing. You think Dumbledore wants someone to get through? I think Dumbledore wants the right person to get through, Harry said. Someone specific. He's not hiding the stone, he's testing the approach to it. Waiting to see who comes for it and whether they have what it takes. Hermione started, and Harry could see her wrestling between that's brilliant and that's insane. That's an enormous risk. If the wrong person gets through, yes, Harry said. Which is why Snape is watching the corridor. And why Quirrell is running out of time. He paused. Whoever is using Quirrell, the entity, not the man, is powerful but currently limited. Embodied parasitically. It can't take the stone directly because the trap is built against direct magical force from someone with the intent to use the stone for harm. It needs a willing intermediary. How do you know that? Because it hasn't happened yet, Harry said simply. If raw power was sufficient, the stone would already be gone. The Cerberus doesn't stop something with Voldemort-level power for long. The traps don't stop someone willing to burn through them rather than solve them. So the approach has to be deceptive. The person reaching the stone has to genuinely not want to use it for harm, which is precisely why it has to be a student, or someone like a student. Someone who'll think of it as a problem to solve rather than a thing to take. Hermione was quiet for a long moment. He's going to try to use you, she said. Voldemort. Through Quirrell. He's going to try to get you to retrieve it. He's going to try, Harry agreed. What are you going to do? Harry picked up his quill and returned to his notes. I'm going to let the situation develop until it reaches the point where intervention is necessary, he said. And then I'm going to intervene. That's terrifyingly vague, Hermione said. It's appropriately vague, Harry said. I don't have all the variables yet. The stone situation resolved in May, and not in the way Harry had been expecting, which was irritating in the specific way of things that fail to be predictable despite your best modeling. The sequence of events was, Hagrid mentioned a dragon egg to someone in a pub, the dragon hatched, the dragon had to be moved, Norbert, which was a terrible name for a dragon, was sent to Romania, and in the chaos of that situation, Draco Malfoy got Harry and Ron in trouble and they ended up serving detention in a forbidden forest at midnight, which was when Harry stood 10 feet from Voldemort crouching over a dead unicorn and drinking its blood. Voldemort looked up. Harry looked back. He had his wand. He had the death note in the inside pocket of his robes. He had an invisibility cloak folded in his bag because he'd brought it to the forest on instinct, which he was grateful for now. The thing in the forest wearing Quirrell's face was not wearing Quirrell's face. It was wearing something else, a fragment of something, barely contained, pressing against the inside of Quirrell's skin like something trying to get out. It turned toward Harry with the particular quality of attention of something that has been looking for you for a very long time. Harry Potter, it said, in Quirrell's ruined voice. Yes, Harry said. It moved toward him and Harry threw the invisibility cloak over himself in one movement and was gone, and for a moment the thing that was Voldemort stood in the clearing with its borrowed face turned in circles, reaching toward a presence it could feel but couldn't find. Harry stood 3 feet away and watched it with his wand in one hand and the death note, which he'd taken out without quite deciding to, in his other hand. He could write Quirrell's name now. He could write it and specify the circumstances, and Quirrell would die of something credible, and the fragment of Voldemort inside him would have nowhere to go and would dissipate, and the stone would be safe, and the problem would be solved. He stood very still for a long moment, thinking about this with complete honesty. Quirrell was already dying. The possession was burning through him at a rate Harry had been tracking all year, the trembling hands, the weight loss, the eyes that were occasionally wrong in ways that meant the thing behind them had too much control. He had months, maybe less. Writing Quirrell's name was not mercy. It was also not murder, in any simple sense. It was the acceleration of an outcome that was already certain, for a purpose that would prevent greater harm. He thought about Light Yagami, who had decided he was the answer rather than having one. He put the death note back in his pocket. He watched Quirrell Voldemort circle the clearing for another 30 seconds, then turned and walked silently back toward the edge of the forest. Behind him, the thing in Quirrell's body let out a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a name, and Harry kept walking. Not yet, he thought. And not this way. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in late May, Harry went down to the 3rd floor. Alone. Not because he didn't trust Hermione and Ron, he did, completely, but because what he was going to do in the room at the end of the traps was not something that required witnesses, and the fewer people who could truthfully describe Harry Potter going through the trapdoor, the better. He left a note in the common room for Hermione that said only, 3rd floor. If I'm not back by tomorrow morning, tell McGonagall. Don't come yourself. He knew she'd consider this instruction for about 4 minutes and then decide whether to obey it based on her own assessment of the situation, which was correct behavior and which he'd accounted for by giving her a 6-hour window. The Cerberus fell asleep to a spell Harry had adapted from a musical lullaby charm he'd found in a second-year music theory book. The Devil's Snare responded to light. The flying keys were won by flying, which was, of all the traps, the one most obviously designed for him specifically, and he acknowledged Dumbledore's craft with a grim internal nod. The chess set could be played through if you understood that the game was weighted for the solver's side by design. The troll was already unconscious, which meant someone had already been this way, recently. The logic puzzle took him 3 minutes. He pocketed the correct potion and moved through the final door. Quirrell was standing in front of the mirror of Eriste. Harry stopped in the doorway and looked at him. Quirrell was shaking, not from cold, from the proximity of the thing inside him to something it desperately wanted. His turban was askew. He looked like a man being turned inside out by a need he couldn't contain. I wondered if it would be you, Quirrell said, without turning around. His voice had that layered quality, Quirrell's voice, and underneath it, something else riding it like a passenger. He said you'd come. He was right, Harry said. Step away from the mirror. Quirrell turned. His eyes were wrong in the way Harry had been cataloging all year, the pupils too narrow, the focus too absolute, the warm nervous professor blankness entirely gone. You don't understand what you're involving yourself in, boy. I understand exactly what I'm involving myself in, Harry said. He moved into the room, past Quirrell, and stood before the mirror of Eriste. He looked at it. He'd read about the mirror. He knew what it showed, the deepest desire of the heart, whatever that was, wherever it lived. He looked into it with the measured neutrality he used for looking at everything he needed to understand before he could act. The mirror showed him standing in a world that was different. Not better in some simple wishful way, different. Structured differently. He could see it in the image, a version of himself standing in the great hall where the house tables were gone, where the seating was different, where there was no high table separating the staff above and the students below. A version of the ministry that he couldn't see clearly but that felt functional, in the way that things feel functional when they're built for use rather than for the maintenance of those who built them. It showed him what he was working toward, not what he was. He felt the stone fall into his pocket. He stepped back from the mirror and looked at Quirrell, who had gone very still. You have it, Quirrell said. Not a question. The voice behind his voice had risen, that other presence, thin and cold and very old, pressing hard against the surface. Give it to me. No, Harry said. Quirrell launched himself forward with a speed that was not human, Voldemort's speed, Voldemort's force, in a body that was breaking apart from the effort of containing it. His hands closed on Harry's robes and Harry felt it immediately, the burning, the contact, like pressing your hand against something electrically charged and held down. Quirrell recoiled. Tried again. His hands blistered where they touched Harry's skin. Harry watched this with the analytical calm that he discovered was either a gift or a condition, depending on how you looked at it. Your master can't touch me, he said. Something to do with the protection from my mother. I've been reading about it. Quirrell's face split. Behind it, not metaphorically, literally, the back of the turban unwinding, the back of his head turning, something looked at Harry with eyes like 2 red lamps. Powerful little boy, Voldemort's voice said, from the back of Quirrell's head, and the sound of it was like a blade drawn across stone, smooth and cold and designed to cut. You could be great. I made others great. I can make you, I'm going to be great, Harry said. Not because of you. He looked at the thing in Quirrell's face and felt something that was not quite anger and not quite pity and was mostly a kind of absolute, grounded certainty. You're a fragment of something that already failed. You'll fail again. Maybe not today, maybe not this year, but the end of this is already decided. And you will decide it? Somebody has to, Harry said. He pulled his hand free of Quirrell's grip, the contact burning both ways, and Quirrell fell. Not from Harry's force. From the accumulated damage of a body that had been burning itself away all year to sustain a passenger it was never built to carry. Quirrell crumpled to the floor and went still, and the red lamp eyes in the back of his head blazed once, brilliantly, and then Voldemort was gone, passing through the room like wind through a gap, cold and purposeless and undirected. Harry crouched next to Quirrell. He was still breathing, barely. Harry looked at him for a long moment, this man who had let something terrible in and been consumed by it, who was probably still somewhere inside, very small and very afraid. He went back up through the traps and out into the corridor and found Professor McGonagall. He spent 3 days in the hospital wing. Madame Pomfrey had views about the blistering on his hands, and Dumbledore came on the second day and sat in a chair by the bed for an hour, and for most of that hour neither of them said anything. You knew I'd go down there, Harry said eventually. I suspected, Dumbledore said. You designed the traps for me. The flying keys. The chess game, I wanted to know, Dumbledore said, quietly, who you were. Before I was too far down the road of assuming I already knew. He looked at Harry with those blue eyes that were never fully warm and never fully calculating and were always both at once. What did you see in the mirror? Harry looked at the ceiling. A better world than this one. Not your parents? No. He paused. I don't remember them. I know that sounds, I know it should feel like a loss. It doesn't feel the way people seem to think it should feel. What I want isn't to have them back. It's to make sure what happened to them doesn't keep happening. Dumbledore was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice had something in it that Harry didn't immediately classify, something he thought, later, was very close to grief. Harry. What happened to Quirrell, happened because you put the stone in a school, Harry said, evenly, not accusatorially. With inadequate security and a compromised staff member and a plan that required an 11-year-old to be your last line of defense. Yes, Dumbledore said. Simply. Accepting it. Harry turned his head to look at him. I'm not angry about it, he said. Which was mostly true. But I need you to understand something. I'm not going to be your contingency plan. I'm not the backup option. If you need me involved in something, tell me directly. I'll make my own decision. But I won't be moved like a piece on a board. No, Dumbledore said, and there was something in how he said it, a recognition, an adjustment. I don't think you would be. He rose, and his robes caught the afternoon light coming through the infirmary window. At the door, he paused. The stone has been destroyed. Nicholas Flamel and I agreed it was the safest course. Good, Harry said. Quirrell died this morning. Harry was quiet. He'd known it was coming. He'd been building toward it in his own head since the dungeon. I know, he said. You don't seem, I do feel it, Harry said. Not defensive. Just accurate. I feel it the same way I feel the weight of every consequence of a broken system. Quirrell made choices. But he also existed in a world that produced the thing that destroyed him, and the world gets some of the weight. He looked at the ceiling again. I'm not going to pretend I'm sad. But I'm not pretending it's nothing either. Dumbledore left. Harry lay in the hospital wing and thought about Quirrell, and about the thin cold wind that had been Voldemort dispersing through the dungeon walls, and about the fact that Voldemort was still out there, less than before, but out there, and about all the things that needed to happen before the end of this. Ron came and brought exploding snap cards and was loudly relieved in the way of people who use noise to express things they don't have the vocabulary for. Hermione came and brought 4 books and sat on the edge of the bed and said, with careful neutrality, "You went alone." "I left a note." "You went alone," she said again, and the precision of repetition was its own argument. Harry looked at her. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were very bright. "I needed to do that particular thing alone," he said. "Not because I don't trust you. Because what happened in that room, the mirror, specifically, was something private. And I didn't know in advance how much of it would be private." Hermione looked at him for a long moment. He watched her decide whether to be angry, and watched her decide against it, not because she wasn't entitled to it but because she'd understood something. "What did you see in the mirror?" she asked. He told her. Not everything, not the specific shape of it, not the ministry without its high table. But the direction of it. "A world that works better than this one," he said. "A world that was made to work better." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, that's a very practical thing to want." "Yes," he said. "Most people, I think, would want their family. Or safety. Or, I had 11 years of wanting those things," Harry said. "I know what they feel like. They're not enough." Hermione looked at him with that look. The data received, processing look. She opened one of the books she'd brought, settled more comfortably on the bed, and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Summer came. Harry went back to the Dursleys. He went back because he didn't yet have a better option, and because having a worse option available is not a reason to reject a bad one. Dumbledore had written to him, a longer letter than Harry expected, thoughtful in its way, about the protection that living with Petunia afforded and why it remained necessary. Harry had read the letter 3 times, filed the reasoning under check against other sources, and written back a polite acknowledgement that gave nothing away. He had 7 weeks. He used them. The first 2 weeks he spent at the public library, which he attended 6 days a week from opening to close, and which had recently acquired an index of newspaper archives that Harry found enormously useful. He was looking for patterns in ministry appointments over the previous 20 years. He found them. They were not subtle if you knew what you were looking at, the same dozen families cycling through the same positions of power, the same names appearing as signatories on the same types of documentation, the same decisions being made by the same people who had been protected by the same other people in preceding years. He built a secondary map in his notebook. Not of individual crimes, though those were there too, and he was thorough about recording them, but of connections. Who owed what to whom? Which positions depended on which alliances? Which alliances depended on which secrets? The Ministry of Magic was not, he concluded, primarily corrupt in the way of individual bad actors. It was corrupt structurally, built on a foundation that required the maintenance of certain inequalities in order to function, and staffed by people who had been so thoroughly acculturated to those inequalities that most of them couldn't see them anymore. You couldn't fix it by removing 3 names from a list. You had to understand the whole architecture before you could determine which load-bearing walls you could take out and which ones, if you pulled them, would bring everything down in the wrong order. He was 12. He had time. He also, in the 4th week of summer, used the death note for the first time. He had thought about it for a long time before he did it. He had drawn up and discarded several drafts of the reasoning, testing it against his own standards, looking for the places where he was rationalizing what he wanted to do rather than reasoning toward what was right. He sat with Ryuk in the too hot dark of the Dursleys' garden. Vernon had locked him out of the house from 8 to 5 each day as punishment for what he'd characterized as strange business associated with Harry's school letters, which was a remarkably mild way to describe the events of Harry's first year, and had an honest conversation. "You're going to do it," Ryuk said. "I'm deciding whether to," Harry said. "You've already decided," Ryuk said. "You're checking your reasoning. There's a difference." Harry looked at the Shinigami. "Is there something wrong with checking your reasoning?" "No," Ryuk said. Light didn't. That's why he went wrong. Harry was quiet for a moment. The file from the restricted section. Rookwood, McNair, and the third one. I know who BC is now. Who? Bartemius Crouch Sr., Harry said. Head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. The one who signed the commutation on Rookwood's conviction. The one whose initial appears on the sealed records for McNair's killings. He looked at the notebook in his hands, his private one, not the death note. His son was the one who tortured the Longbottoms. He got his son out of Azkaban. Used Veritaserum and a ministry trial so compromised that Sirius Black never even got one. Ryuk's lantern eyes moved. Sirius Black. My godfather, Harry said. In Azkaban for 12 years for a crime someone else committed. The file mentions him in the margins, a note about the Black sentencing being expedited. Crouch signed off on it without a trial, because Crouch was in a hurry and because Black was inconvenient and because nobody powerful was going to argue for a man who'd already been painted as a traitor. He opened the death note. He held Rookwood's face in his mind. Not a photograph, he'd never seen a photograph. He'd built a composite from physical descriptions in 3 separate documents, cross-referenced with a half-portrait in a history of unspeakables that had been published in 1974. He held the composite in his mind until it felt solid. You're sure? Ryuk said. Rookwood has been passing intelligence out of the Department of Mysteries for a year and a half since Voldemort's return began, Harry said. He's the reason 3 Aurors have died in incidents that were officially logged as accidents. He will continue doing this until either Voldemort returns fully and doesn't need him anymore, or someone stops him. He looked at Ryuk steadily. He made his choices. He kept making them. This is a consequence of choices, not a punishment I'm inflicting. There's a difference. I think so, Harry said. I might be wrong. I've thought about being wrong. He paused. I'm not certain enough to be comfortable. But I'm certain enough to act. He wrote Rookwood's name. He wrote it in the careful, even handwriting he used for everything important, not rushed, not angry, not with the weight of a man making himself feel powerful. He wrote it the way you write something you've decided is necessary, which is the way you write a grocery list or a calculation or the final answer to a problem you've been working on for a long time. He wrote, Augustus Rookwood. Heart failure. Alone. In his office in the Department of Mysteries, following the discovery of classified documents found on his person related to Lord Voldemort. The documents were already there. Harry had arranged that 3 weeks ago, through a chain of steps that had begun in the Hogwarts library in February and had ended with an anonymous owl delivery to the office of the senior Auror on duty, containing a partial file that pointed toward Rookwood's location as a source of a specific ministry security leak. The owl would be untraceable. Harry had spent 2 weeks ensuring this. The documents in Rookwood's office would be found by the Aurors doing a routine follow-up on an anonymous tip. He closed the death note. Ryuk watched him put it down on the grass. How do you feel? The Shinigami asked. Harry thought about this honestly. Like I've done something I can't undo, he said. And like it needed doing anyway. He looked at the sky. The uncomfortable thing about a decision you're genuinely certain about is that it doesn't feel good. It just feels, done. Ryuk said nothing. He picked up an apple from the grass beside him and ate half of it and thought about the boy sitting in the garden who had just killed a man for the first time and was looking at the sky with no expression on his face and nothing behind his eyes except the quiet arithmetic of what needed to happen next. Ryuk had known Light Yagami, who had killed his first person and felt like a god. He had known other note users, over the centuries, the ones who felt righteous, the ones who felt sick, the ones who felt nothing at all. He had never known one who felt exactly what this felt like, which was the precise, uncomfortable weight of a decision made correctly and still regretted, not for the decision but for the necessity of it. It was, Ryuk thought, the most human thing he had ever witnessed. McNair came 2 weeks later. Harry had spent the intervening time building the circumstantial landscape more carefully, because with McNair there was a living victim, a family of Muggles who had survived the 1979 attacks with injuries documented in Muggle hospital records that Harry had found through the public library's newspaper index. A survivor named Margaret Aldridge, now 63, who had filed a police report that had been quietly buried. Harry wrote the death conditions so that McNair's departure from the world would be preceded by the sealed ministry records becoming accessible, a locked cabinet in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement that McNair himself had access to and had accessed 3 days before, and by the survivor's account reaching an Auror with enough integrity to pursue it. He had identified that Auror, Kingsley Shacklebolt, whose ministry record he'd found in the same restricted section file and who appeared to be one of the small number of people in the system who hadn't been bought. McNair, heart failure. In the committee's holding facility. Following the discovery of sealed records made accessible from Cabinet 7, Ministry Level 4, relating to 3 Muggle killings in November 1979. He closed the notebook. He sat in the dark for a while after, thinking about Margaret Aldridge, who had been 63 years old and 62 when she filed a police report that no one acted on, and 61, and 60, all the way back to 30 years old when someone in the wizarding world decided her life was worth less than nothing. He thought about the arithmetic of injustice, the way it accumulates over time, the way every year a wrong goes unaddressed is a year of someone carrying something they shouldn't have to carry. Next one. Ryuk said. Crouch is more complicated, Harry said. He's not going yet. Why not? Harry picked up his notebook. Because Crouch is a load-bearing wall, he said. If Crouch disappears before I understand what he knows, what he's keeping sealed, what he's using to keep other people in line, then the structure collapses in the wrong order and buries evidence I need. He flipped to the architecture map. He stays until I know exactly what he's protecting. Ryuk looked at the map. It was dense and cross-referenced and covered 3 pages, with lines connecting names to positions to documents to events in an increasingly complex web that Ryuk could see was not the work of a month or a year but of the slow accumulation of someone who had been building this since they were 9 years old in a cupboard. You've been planning this for years, Ryuk said. Yes, Harry said. You were 9. I was 9 and I knew the world was wrong, Harry said. I just didn't have the vocabulary for it yet. Now I do. He looked at the Shinigami. I'm 12, Ryuk. I have time. I'm going to do this correctly. Ryuk looked at him. Then at the map. Then at the death note sitting on the grass beside them. You know, he said, slowly, when I dropped the note, I expected someone dramatic. I know, Harry said. You've mentioned. You are not dramatic. No. You are, Ryuk said, considerably more frightening. Harry looked at him. Good, he said. The Hogwarts letter came in August with a list of second-year supplies that included, unusually, a book called Gilderoy Lockhart's Guide to Household Pests, which appeared on the list 5 additional times under different titles, all by the same author. Harry read the list, noted this with quiet resignation, and added Lockhart to the section of his notebook titled People Who Require Management. He went back to Diagon Alley with the Weasleys. Ron had old in July with the characteristic Weasley warmth that Harry had started to find, without quite meaning to, genuinely comforting, and Hermione's family was there too, and the whole trip had an ordinary joyful chaos to it that Harry absorbed and enjoyed in the direct and uncomplicated way he was learning to enjoy things that were good without needing them to be strategic. In Flourish and Blots, while Lockhart was signing books and performing his own legend for an audience of people who seemed genuinely delighted by it, which told Harry several things about people's relationship with competence versus presentation, he found himself standing next to Hermione, both of them watching the scene. He's completely fraudulent, Hermione said quietly, which surprised Harry because he thought she'd been admiring the performance. Yes, Harry agreed. How long have you known? Since I read the first book, she said. The magical creatures in each chapter, a third year could handle half of them. The tactics he describes are overcomplicated in ways that only make sense if the actual problem was simpler than he's saying. Someone else solved each of these things and Lockhart took credit. She paused. He's going to be our defense teacher, isn't he? Yes. That's going to be a problem. It's going to be an interesting year, Harry said, watching Lockhart sign a copy of Magical Me with a flourish that was visible from across the shop. Lockhart isn't the problem. He's the symptom. The problem is a system that made him defense teacher because he's famous, not because he's qualified. He glanced at Hermione. Sound familiar? Hermione looked at him. Then at the crowd around Lockhart. Then at Harry, who was the most famous student Hogwarts had accepted in a generation and was standing quietly at the edge of the room watching the dynamics with the expression of someone performing an experiment. Yes, she said. It sounds very familiar. Second year is going to be busy, Harry said. More than first year. More than first year. Hermione picked up a copy of Intermediate Transfiguration from the shelf beside her and added it to her pile. Good, she said, with the absolute sincerity of someone for whom busy and good had always meant roughly the same thing. I was getting bored. Harry almost laughed. It came out as a smile, the real one, the one that wasn't calculated, that only appeared when something caught him off guard with its rightness. Don't be bored, he said. What comes next is going to require everything we have. Outside the shop, in the sunlit chaos of Diagon Alley, Draco Malfoy was watching Harry through the window with an expression that had evolved from contempt through confusion and was settling somewhere around something Harry recognized as genuine, reluctant interest. Behind Draco, a tall man in expensive robes stood with his hand on his son's shoulder, Lucius Malfoy, whose name Harry had written on a different page of his notebook, the page that was not the architecture map but the list that was also not yet complete, the list of names that were going to require the most careful and the most permanent handling. Harry looked at Lucius Malfoy through the glass. Lucius looked back, pale and elegant and certain of his own permanence in the world. Harry held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds and then turned back to the bookshelves. He had reading to do. Chapter 4, The Weight of Wings. The Chamber of Secrets opened on a Tuesday. Harry knew it had opened before anyone officially announced it, because he heard the voice in the wall on the second day of term, a cold, sliding whisper that moved through the stone of the castle the way water moves through rock, finding the cracks. Come to me. Let me rip you. Let me tear you. Let me kill you. He was walking back from the library alone when he heard it, and he stopped in the middle of the corridor and turned his head and listened the way he listened to everything, completely, without the noise of his own reaction getting in the way. Parseltongue. He'd read about it. A hereditary trait, associated with Salazar Slytherin's line, the ability to speak to and understand serpents. He'd found a reference to it in a history of magic under dark arts associations, which was interesting because the ability itself wasn't dark, it was the cultural weight attached to it that made it read that way, a distinction Harry found significant and that most of the wizarding world apparently didn't bother to make. He followed the voice. It led him to a stretch of second-floor corridor he knew well, near the girls' bathroom that had contained the troll the previous year, near the entrance to a girls' bathroom that was apparently always flooded and always empty and always smelled of something old and copper-adjacent. He stood outside the bathroom and listened to the voice move downward, through the floor, into something below. He filed it. He went back to his dormitory and opened his private notebook and wrote, Parseltongue. Slytherin's monster. Below the second floor, near Myrtle's bathroom. Something pre-existing the school's current management. Then he went to sleep, because there was nothing actionable yet and sleep deprivation made you stupid, and Harry refused to be stupid. Lockhart's classes were, if anything, worse than Harry had anticipated, which was saying something because Harry had anticipated them being fairly bad. The man had an extraordinary gift for using competence-adjacent language to describe the total absence of competence, which Harry found almost admirable in its purity. He could say things like, the key to any confrontation with a Cornish pixie is to project absolute mastery, and make it sound as though this was information rather than a retreat from information. His classes were basically performances that contained the structural shape of a lesson without any of the actual content. Harry sat through them with the patience of someone who had learned a great deal from bad teachers, because bad teachers, he'd found, taught you two things simultaneously, the subject, which you had to find for yourself elsewhere, and how not to teach, which was frequently more valuable. Lockhart was a masterclass in the mechanics of impression management, in the precise calibration of confidence and warmth and accessibility, and Harry, who needed to understand how people were convinced and controlled, watched every class with complete attention and took away information Lockhart had no idea he was providing. Hermione, who had identified Lockhart as fraudulent in the bookshop and had subsequently spent 2 weeks in a complex internal argument between her principals and her previous admiration, had landed on the side of her principals with the decisive thump of someone who had worked hard to get there. She still answered questions in class, she answered questions in every class, it was essentially reflexive, but with a precision that occasionally made Lockhart pause, and when she corrected one of his spell attributions in the 3rd week, his smile tightened in a way that Harry noted and that Hermione, eyes on her textbook, seemed to have decided was someone else's problem. Ron thought the class was genuinely awful and said so loudly, which was its own kind of useful because it kept Lockhart's attention on the most obvious source of resistance while Harry sat 3 seats away absorbing everything. The first attack came in October. Mrs. Norris, Filch's cat, was found petrified in the corridor below the 2nd floor, message written on the wall in what turned out to be chicken blood, though the initial reaction of the student body was to assume it was something worse. The Chamber of Secrets has been opened. Enemies of the air, beware. Harry, who had been coming back from nearly headless Nick's death day party with Ron and Hermione when they found the scene, stood in the corridor and read the message and thought about Slytherin's monster moving below the floor and thought about what kind of monster would leave a writing on the wall rather than simply attacking, and concluded, theater. Someone wanted fear. Someone wanted the school in a particular kind of controlled panic. That told him something important. Around them, students had begun to gather, the Halloween feast was ending and people were spilling into the corridors and finding the scene and reacting to it with varying degrees of alarm. Draco Malfoy pushed to the front of the crowd, looked at the writing on the wall, and said, "Enemies of the air, beware. You'll be next, mudbloods," with a performance of satisfaction that Harry watched carefully. Not genuine satisfaction. Performed satisfaction. There was a difference in the set of the jaw, the eyes. Draco was playing a role he'd been given, the inevitable heir to a pure-blood dynasty's expectations, wearing it the way he wore his robes. Harry had been watching Draco all year and had concluded something that he hadn't yet told anyone: Draco Malfoy was not his father's creature by choice. He was his father's creature by default, by the accumulated weight of never having been shown another option. This was not an excuse. But it was a distinction. Snape appeared through the crowd, took in the scene with the particular efficiency of a man who's been at a school long enough to have already thought about most of the bad things that could happen in it. His eyes moved to Harry, Ron, and Hermione, the 3 of them standing in the corridor with the expressions of people who had arrived at the scene rather than created it, though Snape's expression suggested he was maintaining skepticism about this distinction. "Follow me," he said. "All 3 of you." McGonagall and Dumbledore were already there by the time they arrived. Mrs. Norris was revived eventually, and the official investigation began in that particular way of official school investigations, visible, earnest, and pointed at approximately the wrong things. Harry told them what he'd seen, the cat, the message, the crowd. He did not tell them about the voice in the walls. Not yet. He needed more data. His strategy for the chamber situation was, characteristically, patient. He identified 3 parallel tracks. The first, find out what Slytherin's monster was and how to neutralize it without anyone else getting hurt. The second, identify who was controlling it, because something that followed directions was being directed, and the theater of the message on the wall meant that whoever was directing it had an audience in mind. The third, do both of these things without becoming the primary suspect himself, because Harry was very aware that his position in this school, famous, Parseltongue-speaking, Slytherin adjacent by the Hat's assessment, connected to the most powerful dark wizard of the age by prophecy, made him an obvious target for exactly the kind of accusation that would slow everything down. He shared track 1 and 2 with Hermione. Track 3 he kept to himself, because Hermione's response to "people might blame me for this" was to want to defend him loudly and publicly, which was the right instinct and the wrong tactic. The restricted section again, Hermione said, when Harry outlined what he needed. "Not this time," Harry said. "I need a different angle. I need to know what Slytherin is recorded as creating." The school's own historical records, there must be something in the official histories about the chamber's construction. Hogwarts, a history doesn't mention it, Hermione said immediately. I checked after the message appeared. Which is interesting in itself, Harry said. What do you leave out of an official history? The things you don't want people to look for, Hermione said, and met his eyes. The library archives. The original building records for the castle. Madame Pants won't let us near those. Madame Pants won't let us near those, Hermione said, with the precise emphasis of someone who had thought of a workaround and was waiting to see if Harry would get there first. He looked at her. You're going to ask a teacher. Professor Binns, she said. He was there when the castle was built, essentially. He lived through the founding period. He teaches history of magic with all the enthusiasm of a man who has forgotten that the past was interesting when it was happening, but he knows it. If I ask him directly, after class, about the chamber, he'll talk for 2 hours, Harry said. Yes, Hermione said. I'll take notes. She came back 3 days later with 6 pages of notes and the information that Slytherin's creation had been referenced in 3 different founding-era accounts, always obliquely, always as the Great Serpent, and that the most complete reference placed the chamber's entrance somewhere in the school's original plumbing, which had been built in the medieval period before the school expanded. The bathroom, Harry said. Myrtle's bathroom. It's the oldest one in the castle, the plumbing hasn't been updated since the medieval period. I looked it up in the maintenance records. Hermione stared at him. You looked up the maintenance records? They're in a filing cabinet in Filch's office, Harry said. Not locked. How did you get into Filch's office? Harry gave her a look. The invisibility cloak, she said. Right. Obviously. She pressed her lips together in the way she did when she was deciding whether to have a principle about something. The basilisk, she said then, moving past it with characteristic efficiency. That's what it is. I've been reading about serpents large enough to be called the Great Serpent and capable of the kind of petrification the victims have shown, not true death, petrification, which means the killing mechanism is indirect. The eyes, Harry said. Direct eye contact kills, Hermione confirmed. Indirect, reflection, through something else, through glass, causes petrification. Which explains why no one has died yet. They've all seen it indirectly. She paused. Eventually someone won't. Yes, Harry said. We need to move faster. The polyjuice potion, Hermione said. I've already started it. Harry looked at her. I've been brewing it since October, she said, with the composure of someone who has committed to something and decided retrospectively to be calm about it. It takes a month. It requires ingredients from the restricted section, which I've obtained. A pause. Don't ask how. Harry looked at her for a long moment. Then, which Slytherin are we targeting? Crabbe or Goyle, Hermione said. I was thinking Crabbe. He's less observant. Draco knows where the chamber entrance is, Harry said. Or he knows more than he's saying. The air business, he's playing to the crowd, but he knows something. He leaned back in his chair. 1 month from now. 1 month from now, Hermione agreed. The attacks continued through November and into December. Colin Creevey was petrified. Justin Finch-Fletchery was petrified. Nearly Headless Nick was petrified, which apparently could happen to ghosts under the right conditions and which Harry found philosophically interesting but tabled for later. Each attack was carefully indirect, never full eye contact, always a deflection, a puddle or a camera lens or a ghost between the basilisk's gaze and the victim. As though the basilisk was being directed to stop short of killing. Someone doesn't want deaths yet, Harry noted. The theater of fear is the point. Petrification is reversible, deaths would force a closure of the school and a full ministry investigation. Whoever is controlling this wants the school open. Wants the fear ongoing. He kept this in his notebook and thought about what kind of goal required sustained fear in a contained environment with a non-lethal, so far, weapon. Practice, he thought. Or demonstration. Someone proving a capability to someone. This led him somewhere he didn't like. To a small, battered diary he'd seen Ginny Weasley carrying in September, found abandoned in Myrtle's flooded bathroom. He'd noticed it because it was out of place, a diary in a bathroom, with no name on it, the kind of object that shows up in the wrong location when someone is distressed enough that objects start migrating with them. He went back to the bathroom. The diary was gone. Ginny had taken it back. He noted this. He kept watching. The polyjuice potion was ready on Christmas Eve. They used it on Crabbe and Goyle, who were lured into eating drugged cakes that Ron had left in the corridor with the kind of inspired simplicity that required not thinking too hard about whether it would work. Harry took the hair from Goyle, Hermione from a cat she'd found in the wrong place at the wrong moment, and Ron from Crabbe. Harry became Goyle with a discomfort that he found difficult to process analytically because it was too visceral, the body wrong in its size, in its weight distribution, in the particular dullness of Goyle's physical senses that Harry noticed immediately because his own were considerably sharper. He spent 30 seconds adjusting to the new body and then followed Ron as Crabbe to the Slytherin common room. The Slytherin common room was below the lake. Green light filtered through the dungeon windows, the kind of light that existed at the bottom of things. It was, Harry thought, a more honest aesthetic than Gryffindor's, less aspirational, more contained. The furniture was dark and heavy and old. On the walls, the house's history was displayed without apology. Draco was waiting for them, clearly expecting Crabbe and Goyle, and launched immediately into the kind of unguarded monologue that people deliver to people they've decided are furniture. Father says the chamber was opened before, 50 years ago, and the school was nearly closed then. The last time, the monster drove out all the mudbloods. He was pacing, which was new, Draco in public never paced. Someone's doing it this time. And I know who I'd like it to be. He looked at Goyle, at Harry and Goyle's body, and his face was strange, complicated, the performance dropped in the way it dropped when he thought only Crabbe and Goyle were looking. Do you ever wonder, he said, if what he wants is, he stopped himself. Looked at the fire. What? Harry said, in Goyle's voice. Draco shook his head. The moment closed. Nothing. Forget it. The composure came back up like a window blind, efficient and complete. Whoever the heir is, they're not going to stop now. He looked at them. Just don't be in the corridors alone. Harry held Goyle's face and thought, he doesn't know who's doing it. He knows there's supposed to be an heir. He's been told to perform certainty about it. And somewhere in there, when he thought only Crabbe and Goyle were listening, he almost asked whether his father's version of the world was the right one. That was the most useful piece of information Harry had collected all year. The potion wore off and Harry did not tell Ron what he'd observed, not because Ron wasn't trustworthy but because Ron's relationship with Draco was too reactive to be useful here. He told Hermione, who listened with her hands flat on the table and her eyes steady. He's not a committed ideologue, she said. He's a frightened boy performing one. Yes, Harry said. That doesn't make him safe. No, Harry said. But it makes him a different kind of problem. He paused. What happened to Hermione? You never came out of the bathroom. Hermione looked at him with an expression that was very composed and very pained simultaneously. The hair, she said, was from a cat, not a Slytherin girl. A pause. I've been in the hospital wing for the last hour. Madame Pomfrey is handling it. I'm fine. Don't make it worse are you all right? I have fur, Hermione said, with the dignity of someone determined not to be undone by fur. Temporarily. I'm fine. She folded her hands. What did you find out? Harry told her. She listened. Her eyes did their rapid processing movement. The diary, she said, at the end. The diary, Harry agreed. You've been thinking about that since October, she said. Yes. You think it's the source of the control? Whatever's directing the basilisk. I think it's a vessel, Harry said. Something stored in an object. Slytherin's magic, founding-era magic, was considerably more complex than the curriculum suggests. The chamber, the monster, the air, it's a system. Systems have a control point. He looked at her. Ginny Weasley is the control point. Not maliciously. She's been used as one. Hermione went very still. We need to get that diary. Yes, Harry said. We need to do it without spooking whoever put it in her hands. He thought about Lucius Malfoy in Flourish and Blots, his hand on Ginny's books, smooth and proprietary and absolutely certain of his own permanence. The diary, second-hand shop shabby, tucked into a cauldron that had been picked up and handled. And I think I know who that was. He found the diary in Ginny's dormitory. He wasn't going to use the invisibility cloak for this, it felt wrong, a line he'd thought about. He found it because Ginny, who was 12 and frightened and increasingly pale and hollow-eyed in a way that nobody official had noticed yet, had left it in a textbook she'd carried to the common room and then fled, abandoning the book on a chair when Peeves started making noise near the portrait hole and she'd startled badly and run. Harry picked up the textbook. The diary fell out of it. He held it for a moment. It was small and black and had T.M. Riddle on the cover in faded gold letters. He opened it. Blank pages, which meant either it had been used up or it only revealed itself under specific conditions. He took a quill and wrote, "My name is Harry Potter." The ink sank into the page and disappeared. He watched the page, waiting. Then ink rose from it, not his ink, different ink entirely, flowing in a handwriting that was elegant and deliberate. "Hello, Harry Potter. I've been hoping you'd find this." Harry looked at the name on the cover. T.M. Riddle. He thought about Voldemort, who had been born Tom Marvolo Riddle. He'd read this in The Rise and Fall of the Dark Arts, the annotated copy Hermione had given him. He thought about a vessel that talked. He thought about Quirrell's corridor, the thing pressing against the inside of Quirrell's skin. He was holding a piece of Voldemort in his hands. He turned the diary over. He looked at it with complete steadiness. Then he wrote, "What are you?" "A memory," the diary wrote back. "Preserved in here 50 years ago. I was 16 when I caught the basilisk's first victim. When I identified the true culprit." A pause, ink flowing smoothly. "I can show you, Harry, if you'd like." "Who was the true culprit?" Harry wrote. "Hagrid," the diary wrote. "Rubeus Hagrid, 3rd year. He had a monster in a box." Harry looked at this for a long time. He thought about Hagrid, enormous, warm, completely incapable of dissembling in any meaningful way, as honest as anyone Harry had met, being accused of opening a chamber by a teenage Voldemort who had needed someone to blame. He thought about Hagrid being expelled and never being allowed to use his wand properly for the rest of his life because of a lie told 50 years ago by the thing currently writing to him in friendly copperplate. He closed the diary. He put it in his pocket. He was not going to write in it again. That evening, he went to Moaning Myrtle's bathroom alone, stood in front of the sink and said, in Parseltongue, the sounds forming in his throat in a way that felt both natural and faintly wrong, "Open." The sink moved. The pipe opened. Harry looked down into the darkness below the school. He jumped. The slide was long and dark and ended in a tunnel that smelled of old water and stone and something cold and reptilian. Harry lit his wand and walked forward, because the problem with waiting was that Ginny Weasley was getting paler every week and nobody official was moving fast enough, and the basilisk was going to eventually find a pair of direct eyes instead of a reflection, and when that happened someone would die and the diplomatic fallout would bury everything he actually needed to do. The Chamber of Secrets was real. It was vast and wet and lit by a green glow that came from the walls themselves, the old magic of the school's foundations, and at the far end, separated from Harry by a long corridor of stone serpents, was a girl lying on the damp floor. Ginny Weasley. Not moving. The diary beside her. Harry moved toward her, but stopped. Because standing between him and Ginny, materializing from the air with the particular slow deliberateness of something that has been waiting for this moment, was a 16-year-old boy who was not entirely real. Tom Riddle. Or rather, the memory of Tom Riddle, more solid and present than a memory had any right to be, wearing Hogwarts robes and holding Harry's wand, which he'd apparently taken from Ginny while she was unconscious. Harry Potter, the memory said, in a voice that was warm and interested and thoroughly wrong. At last. Give me my wand, Harry said. Tom Riddle smiled. He had a handsome face, Harry could see that clearly, the kind of face that people trusted because it was constructed for trust, every feature calibrated. I don't think so, he said. Not yet. I want to talk first. Talk then, Harry said. Tom Riddle tilted his head. He'd clearly prepared for several versions of this encounter and was recalibrating in real time, the way very intelligent people recalibrate, quickly, without showing the working. You're not frightened, he said. Of a memory? Harry said. No. I'm more than a memory, Riddle said. Every second I talk to you, I grow more real. Ginny's been pouring herself into me all year, her fears, her secrets, her life force. She's nearly gone. And when she's gone, I'll be real enough to open the chamber fully, Harry said. Yes. I understand the mechanism. You needed a host. You needed someone who would talk to you enough to sustain you. He looked at the diary on the floor beside Ginny. Clever. Using the diary as a vessel for a fragment of yourself. Something shifted in Riddle's handsome face. A flicker of genuine surprise, quickly contained. You know about the vessel. I know about what you are, Harry said. Tom Riddle. Voldemort, before you were Voldemort. 16 years old, brilliant, building the architecture of something you called greatness. He kept his voice entirely level. I've read about what you became. And yet here you are, Riddle said, without your wand. In the chamber. Alone. Here I am, Harry agreed. He didn't have his wand. He had his wits, and the specific knowledge of what a basilisk could and couldn't do, and the fact that the only way to destroy a Horcrux, because that's what this was, he was almost certain, a piece of soul stored in an object, was to damage the vessel so completely that the soul fragment couldn't survive it. He also had the basilisk itself, which was somewhere in this chamber, waiting. Speak to it, Riddle said, pleasantly. I know you can. Tell it to come. Watch what it does to you. Why would I do that? Harry said. Because you have no wand, no. A sound from above, massive, rushing, and then Fawkes arrived through the chamber ceiling in a column of flame, carrying the old sorting hat and dropping both in front of Harry before banking away with a cry that was like light-given sound. Harry pulled the sorting hat onto his head in one motion. I don't usually, the hat started. Now, Harry said. Please. Something hard and heavy fell out of the hat into his hand. He pulled it out. A sword. Silver, with rubies in the hilt, old and completely real in the way that truly useful things are real. Godric Gryffindor's sword. Harry looked at it for approximately 1 second, then looked at the diary on the floor, and drove the sword through it. The effect was immediate and total. The diary screamed, not literally, but the effect of the destruction moved through the chamber the way a scream moves through a space, a resonance that was felt rather than heard. Tom Riddle's image flickered, shredded, blazed, his handsome composed face finally losing its composure in the extremity of dissolution, showing something underneath that was not warm or clever or interested in anything except its own continuation. He looked at Harry with the last of the soul fragment's awareness, and what Harry saw in that look was neither hatred nor intelligence but simple, animal want, the want to exist at any cost, the want that had driven Tom Riddle to divide his soul rather than accept the possibility of not being. Then he was gone. Ginny gasped awake on the floor. Harry was already crouching beside her, his hand on her arm. You're all right, he said. It's over. The diary's destroyed. Ginny looked at him with red-rimmed eyes that were struggling to focus, half present and half wherever the memory of Riddle had been keeping her. I couldn't stop, you were 12 and it was a piece of Voldemort, Harry said. No one stops that easily. He helped her sit up. Can you walk? I think so. She looked at his face, then at the destroyed diary, then at the sword he was holding. How did you, later, Harry said. Let's go up. The school year ended with several overlapping pieces of business. Dumbledore was returned from his enforced absence, the governors had sent him away during the crisis, and Harry, reviewing the sequence of events, identified Lucius Malfoy's signature on the governor's petition and understood it as a calculated move to remove the headmaster during the chamber's operation. Harry filed this under the architecture map, under Lucius's name, with a note, direct involvement in Ginny Weasley's endangerment. Deliberate. Board leverage used as cover for chamber operation. He sat with this for 3 days, running the reasoning against his own standards. Lucius Malfoy had put a piece of Voldemort into the hands of an 11-year-old girl and sent her into a school year carrying it. He'd done it to discredit Arthur Weasley, the Muggle Protection Act connection was in the newspaper archives Harry had been reading, and to use Ginny as a mechanism for opening the chamber without direct involvement. He'd endangered the lives of everyone who'd been petrified. He'd endangered Ginny Weasley's life directly. And he'd done it from behind institutional cover, using his position on the school's board of governors and his network of social protection to make himself invisible as the source. This was not a case where Harry was uncertain. He opened his private notebook. He turned to the architecture map and found Lucius Malfoy's entry, the one that had said requires most careful and permanent handling. He looked at it for a long time. He thought about Draco Malfoy, pacing in the Slytherin common room, almost asking a question about his father and stopping himself. He turned to a clean page. He wrote, Lucius Malfoy, direct facilitation of the Chamber of Secrets operation. Endangerment of 36 students and 1 teacher. Possession and distribution of a dark artifact, Horcrux, fragment of Voldemort's soul, to a minor. Board manipulation to remove school protection during active magical threat. He wrote it all out because writing it out made it concrete and concrete things could be examined clearly. Then he closed the notebook and opened the death note. He held Lucius Malfoy's face in his mind. Not a composite this time, a real face, seen clearly across a bookshop, seen through a window on a bright summer day, pale and certain and arranged for the permanent assumption of its own importance. He thought about what he'd written. He thought about the girl on the chamber floor and how close it had been. He thought about Draco almost asking a question that his father's world had never given him permission to ask. He thought about what Rookwood's death had taught him, that he could do this, and that doing it correctly was different from doing it emotionally, and that the difference between those two things was the only line he had. He thought about Draco. Then he wrote in the death note, in his careful even hand, and what he wrote was not Lucius Malfoy's name. What he wrote was a different kind of instruction, a circumstance, a sequence of events, a carefully constructed chain of consequences that would result in Lucius Malfoy being stripped of his position, his access, his institutional cover, and his freedom of movement, without dying. He constructed it over 4 pages of conditions, detailed, specific, cross-referenced against the ministry's own legal structure, because the death note allowed complex behavioral specifications and Harry had spent a year learning exactly how far that capability could be stretched. Lucius Abraxas Malfoy. The following sequence of events, occurring within the next 3 months. He wrote the conditions. The discovery of his role in the diary. The Auror investigation. The specific testimony that would emerge from a source within the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, Kingsley Shacklebolt, who had already been placed by Harry's prior maneuvering in a position to receive certain information. The stripping of his role as school governor. The house arrest pending trial. Not death. Not yet. Not while Draco was 13 and asking questions he hadn't been given permission to ask. He closed the death note. Ryuk appeared in the corner of the dormitory, because of course he was there, and looked at what Harry had done with the expression of someone watching an experiment they hadn't anticipated. Not dead, Ryuk said. Not dead, Harry agreed. You could have killed him. Yes, Harry said. Deserving and deciding are different things, Harry said. Lucius Malfoy dead is a martyr for the pureblood movement and a grief for a 13-year-old boy who is almost asking the right questions. Lucius Malfoy in house arrest awaiting trial, with his position stripped and his social capital gone and no institutional cover left, is something that actually changes the shape of things. He put the death note under his mattress. And I might still kill him later. But not before I'm certain it's necessary. Ryuk looked at him. You're very calm about this. I think about it a lot, Harry said. The calmness isn't absence of feeling. It's the result of thinking about feeling very carefully. He looked out the window at the end-of-term sky over the grounds, the summer coming in green and gold off the lake. I feel all of it. I just don't let it drive. The year ended. Exams were taken, Harry and Hermione finishing at the top of the year, Ron somewhere creditably in the middle, Neville passing everything for the first time in his short academic career with a particularly strong performance in herbology that got him a personal note from Professor Sprout. On the train home, the four of them occupied a compartment and the conversation moved in the easy way of people who had been through something together and were now sitting in the ordinary aftermath of it. Ron fell asleep against the window. Neville was reading a herbology journal. Hermione had 3 books but wasn't reading any of them, just holding them, watching the country go past. You're going to be all right, Harry told her, because she'd been quiet in a specific way since the chamber and he recognized it as the particular quiet of someone processing something that had frightened them on your behalf. I know, she said. I'm not, it's not that I think you can't handle things. She paused. It's that you handle them so, she searched for the word. Completely. You go in alone and you come out with Ginny Weasley and a sword and you look exactly the same as when you went in. Would you prefer I come out looking different? I'd prefer, Hermione said carefully, to be more useful to you. I was in the hospital wing with cat fur. I wasn't there. You built the diagnostic framework that identified the basilisk, Harry said. You put the page in your hand before petrification hit you, I found it later. You figured out the monster and the mechanism and handed me the critical information before going down. That's not useful, that's essential. He looked at her steadily. You don't have to be in the chamber to matter to what happens in it. Hermione looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the top book from her pile and opened it, which was her way of deciding a conversation was resolved and she could stop maintaining the performance of composure that she'd been holding. Her hands were steady. Her face was still. 3rd year, she said, at the page. 3rd year, Harry said. He looked out the window at the country going past, green and ordinary and full of people who didn't know that the Chamber of Secrets had opened and been closed, who didn't know that a piece of Voldemort had been destroyed, who didn't know that a 12-year-old had walked into the basement of a school built on ancient magic and walked out with a sword and a plan. He thought about Lucius Malfoy's conditions, written and set in motion. He thought about the architecture map in his notebook and all the names that remained on it. He thought about Sirius Black, who had been in Azkaban for 12 years for a crime he hadn't committed, and who was still there, and whose name had appeared at the edge of Harry's research like a wound that kept reopening. He thought about what came next. The train moved through the summer country, and Harry Potter sat in a train compartment and thought about justice with the patience of someone who understood that patience and urgency were not opposites, that you could be both, simultaneously, and that the trick was knowing which moment called for which. He was 12 years old. He had a long way to go. But the architecture was building. Name by name, choice by choice, the slow careful dismantling of the machine that had made the world into what it was. He put his hand in his pocket. Felt the edge of the notebook. Felt the shape of what he was building. Outside the window, the country ran green and wide and open in every direction, and somewhere in all of that, the world was waiting to be different. He was going to make it different. One name at a time. Chapter 5, Fire in the Framework. The summer before 3rd year, Sirius Black escaped from Azkaban. Harry read about it in the Daily Prophet on a Wednesday morning, sitting at the Dursleys' kitchen table eating toast while Vernon read the sports section and Dudley ate cereal in the particular aggressive way Dudley did everything. The headline was enormous: "Sirius Black escapes," with a photograph of a gaunt man screaming at something off-camera, his hair wild, his eyes burning with an intensity that the photograph couldn't quite contain even in its small newsprint frame. Harry looked at the photograph for a long time. He'd been building the Sirius Black file since Christmas of his first year, when the name had appeared in the margins of the ministry document from the restricted section. What he knew now was considerably more than he'd known then. He'd spent 2 summers assembling it: newspaper archives, court records, Aura Department annual reports that were available in the public section of the Wizarding Library he'd found in Charing Cross Road, and one very specific conversation with Arthur Weasley at the end of second year, conducted over dinner while Ron was distracted by his brothers and Molly was in the kitchen, in which Harry had asked careful questions and received honest answers from a man who was fundamentally incapable of political calculation. The picture that emerged was this: Sirius Black had been arrested the day after Voldemort's fall, charged with the murder of Peter Pettigrew and 12 Muggles, convicted on the testimony of surviving Aurors who'd found the scene, and sent to Azkaban without trial. Without a Wisengamot hearing. Without a lawyer, a defense, or any of the procedural protections that the ministry's own charter explicitly guaranteed to every accused person. Bartemius Crouch Sr. had signed the commitment order. Harry looked at the photograph. The screaming man. His godfather, whom he'd never met, who had been in Azkaban for 12 years for something he hadn't done, and who had now escaped. He put the newspaper down. He finished his toast. He went upstairs and opened his private notebook. The Sirius Black page was dense with cross-references. At the top, he'd written, Peter Pettigrew, listed as dead. 12 Muggles, genuine. But Pettigrew was a Death Eater. Capable of the Fidelius charm. Capable of faking death. The explosion pattern described in the Aura report: outward, not inward. Someone exploded the street from inside the crowd, then disappeared in the chaos. He turned to the architecture map. Found Crouch's entry. Added, Sirius Black commitment order, no trial, personal signature only. Third improper use of ministerial authority confirmed. Then he turned back to the Sirius Black page and added, escaped. Azkaban. Summer. Motivation unknown, but if Black knows Pettigrew is alive, he's not escaping because he's lost his mind. He's escaping because he has somewhere to go. He thought about that for a while. Then he wrote, Pettigrew. Find Pettigrew. He found Pettigrew on the Hogwarts Express. Not immediately, not on the first pass through the corridor, not in any of the compartments where the faces he saw were the faces he expected. He found him because he'd been looking for 12 years of inconsistency in the record, and the inconsistency was a rat. Professor Lupin was in their compartment, asleep when they boarded, a traveling wizard in battered robes who turned out to be the new defense against the dark arts teacher, which Harry had not known in advance but filed immediately as significant: real credentials, real competence, the particular quality of someone who knew things from experience rather than from books. Harry had assessed this in approximately 60 seconds and had spent the rest of the journey reading and occasionally watching Lupin sleep, because sleeping told you things about people that waking didn't. What it told him about Lupin: exhausted, genuinely. Not performing rest but collapsed into it. Old exhaustion, years of it, the kind that had settled into the bones. And thin in the way of someone who didn't always eat enough, not from poverty necessarily but from a life that periodically disrupted the ordinary rhythms. Werewolf, Harry had written in his notebook, between Crewe and Lancaster, after observing the scars on Lupin's hands and the particular dates of his absences listed in the Hogwarts staff announcement. Ron had fallen asleep. Hermione was reading. Neville was eating a chocolate frog. Harry looked at Scabbers in Ron's coat pocket, sticking his nose out at the moving landscape. He looked at the rat for a long time, with the particular attention he paid to things that nagged at him without providing a clear reason. The rat was old. Much too old for a rat. Ron had mentioned this himself, that Scabbers had been in the family for 12 years. A rat's natural lifespan was 3 years. This rat had been in the Weasley family for exactly as long as Sirius Black had been in Azkaban. And the rat was missing a toe on his front left paw, which corresponded to the detail in the Aura report that described Pettigrew's finger being found at the explosion site. Harry closed his notebook. Looked at the rat again. Well, he thought. He didn't move yet. He let the train arrive, let the Thestrals pull the carriages, let the year begin. He needed to know what Lupin knew before he moved on Pettigrew, because Lupin was clearly connected to the whole architecture of that period, the Marauders, the Potters, Pettigrew, and Lupin's knowledge was going to matter. He went to Lupin's office in the first week of term, without an appointment, and knocked. "Come in," Lupin said, with the voice of someone who had been expecting, not Harry specifically, but the category of student who arrives without appointment and with questions. Harry sat in the chair across from the desk and looked at Lupin. Lupin looked back with the particular quality of a man who was trying to appear less interested than he was. "You knew my parents," Harry said. A pause. "Yes. You were a marauder. Prongs, Padfoot, Wormtail, and Moony. The nicknames correspond to animagus forms and a werewolf." Harry watched Lupin's careful face. "Padfoot is Sirius Black. Wormtail is Peter Pettigrew. Prongs is my father." He met Lupin's eyes. "Moony is you." Lupin looked at him for a long moment. Outside the window, the grounds were going gold with September. "You've done considerable research," he said finally. "You're not surprised?" "No," Lupin said. No. Not surprised." Something moved in his face, grief, Harry thought, the old kind that had settled so deep it barely showed any more except in specific triggers. "How long have you known?" "Since I found a ministry file in the restricted section in first year," Harry said. "I've been building the picture since then." He looked at Lupin steadily. "I know Sirius Black is innocent." The grief in Lupin's face was replaced by something more active, sharp, present, almost desperate. "How, Peter Pettigrew is alive," Harry said. "He's been living as a rat in the Weasley family for 12 years. He paused. "I need to know what you know about that night. About what happened before my parents died." Lupin was very still. Harry watched him deciding, watched the calculation moving behind the tired eyes, the weighing of disclosure against whatever oath or instinct had kept this information contained for 12 years. "You could go to Dumbledore," Lupin said. "I'm talking to you," Harry said. "I want the version that comes from someone who was actually there, not the version that's been shaped by institutional interests." Another pause. Lupin almost smiled, something brief and complicated. "You sound very much like your mother," he said. "She used to go straight for the uncomfortable truth like that. James would approach it sideways. Lily walked right up to it and looked it in the face." "Tell me about Pettigrew," Harry said. Lupin told him. It took an hour. The secret keeper switch, the last-minute change from Sirius to Peter, Sirius's idea, thinking Peter was the least obvious choice, not knowing that Peter had already made a different choice by then, had already been feeding information to Voldemort for a year. The night of the Potters' deaths, Sirius going to the house, finding the ruins, finding Harry alive, leaving Harry with Hagrid because Dumbledore had already ordered the handoff, then going after Peter. The confrontation on the street. Peter's cry of Sirius betrayed them, loud enough for witnesses, before he blew the street open and disappeared. Harry listened to all of it without interrupting. When Lupin was done, Harry said, "You've believed Sirius was innocent for 12 years. Yes. You didn't do anything." The pain in Lupin's face was absolute. "I had no proof. And I am what I am, Harry. A werewolf. My credibility with the ministry is worth approximately nothing. Any accusation I made would have been dismissed and would have put a target on me." He looked at his hands. "I told myself it was pragmatism. I think mostly it was cowardice. I'm not asking you to flog yourself about it, Harry said. I'm asking you to help me fix it now. Lupin looked up. Pettigrew is Scabbers, Harry said. He's in Ron's coat pocket probably right now. We need to get him alive, to the right people, on record. Not the ministry is compromised. We need someone with enough integrity and enough standing to force an inquiry. He thought about Kingsley Shacklebolt. I have someone in mind. You're 13, Lupin said, not dismissively. More like he was reminding himself of a fact he kept losing hold of. Pettigrew being alive is the evidence that everything else was wrong, Harry said. Not just for Sirius. For the conviction. For the process. A man sent to Azkaban without trial is a precedent that the Ministry can use again and again and will, unless it's challenged with a specific case that makes the wrongness impossible to dismiss. He met Lupin's eyes. This is not just about getting Sirius out. This is about proving the Ministry committed a crime against him, and forcing the procedural consequence. Lupin stared at him. You've thought about this for a very long time. Yes, Harry said. Since first year. Since first year. Lupin was quiet for a moment. What do you need me to do? Getting Pettigrew was the work of 3 weeks and required the cooperation of Hermione, who was furious on Ron's behalf in a way that was personally complicated for her because she was also furious at the rat for 12 years of deception that she had had no reason to suspect and therefore couldn't have prevented and yet somehow felt partially responsible for, which was so precisely Hermione that Harry didn't bother pointing out its irrationality. He told Ron on a Thursday evening in the common room, after Neville had gone to bed and the fire had burned low. He sat across from Ron and told him about Pettigrew, all of it, the Ministry file, the missing finger, the lifespan, the timeline, and watched Ron's face go through the sequence, confusion, disbelief, the particular expression of someone whose loyalty is comprehensive enough that being betrayed by something they trusted hits them physically. Scabbers, Ron said, looking at his coat pocket. Yes, Harry said. Ron was quiet for a moment. Then, right, he said, with the decisive simplicity of someone who had finished processing and was ready to act. What do we do? Harry had always found this about Ron, the way his response to terrible information was not extended grief or analysis but a rapid pivot to what do we do, which was either the least sophisticated or the most courageous thing Harry had encountered, and he'd concluded it was both simultaneously. The capture was straightforward in conception and complicated in execution, in the way of most things involving live targets. Lupin handled the transformation, a specific spell that forced an animagus back to human form, which Lupin had researched in the week following Harry's visit to his office with the focused intensity of a man who had been waiting 12 years for a reason to act. It happened in the Shrieking Shack, which was not the shack's only notorious quality but was certainly its most recent, and Pettigrew in human form was exactly what Harry had predicted, a small, pallid, sweating man whose face was arranged permanently for sympathy and whose eyes moved to exits with the instinct of someone who had been prey for a very long time and had survived by making themselves useful. He looked at Harry. His eyes went wet. Your mother, he started, she was my, don't, Harry said. Pettigrew closed his mouth. You're going to make a statement, Harry said. One sworn testimony, witnessed by Professor Lupin. Everything, the secret keeper switch, the information you passed to Voldemort, the night of October 31st, the street. All of it. He looked at Pettigrew with the same measured attention he gave everything. Then you're going to go with Lupin to a ministry order I've specified, and the testimony is going to be given in a proper setting, and Sirius Black is going to get a trial. Pettigrew was looking at him with the expression of someone trying to locate leverage they don't have. And what happens to me? That's for the Wisengamot, Harry said. If I confess, you're already caught, Harry said, with perfect patience. There's no version of this where you don't confess. There's a version where you confess voluntarily and I ask Lupin to note that cooperation in his report, and there's a version where you don't, which produces the same outcome on a longer timeline. Choose. Pettigrew chose. He always chose survival, it was the only thing he'd ever been consistent about. Sirius Black was released from Azkaban in November of Harry's third year, after a Wisengamot hearing that lasted 4 days and produced a finding of wrongful imprisonment that sent 3 ripples through the ministry simultaneously: the demand for an inquiry into Crouch's use of ministerial authority, the invalidation of 6 other commitments signed under the same provision, and a Daily Prophet headline that Harry read and then set aside because the headline missed the point, which was that the cracks in the ministry's foundation were now public record rather than just his. He'd sent the Wisengamot hearing transcript to Hermione the day it ended. She'd written back in 4 pages of dense analysis with a note at the top: the Crouch inquiry is going to be bigger than they're announcing. Someone's protecting him from above. Find who? Harry was already looking. Sirius Black came to Hogsmeade in December, which was not technically permitted under the terms of his release. There were conditions still being sorted, but Sirius, Harry rapidly discovered, had a complicated relationship with conditions. He met him at the 3 Broomsticks on a Saturday, which Sirius had arranged through Lupin with characteristic directness, a letter to Harry that said simply 3 Broomsticks, Saturday, noon. I'll buy the butterbeer. Sirius. Harry arrived at 11:45. Sirius was already there. 12 years of Azkaban had left marks that couldn't be entirely erased by a month of freedom: the gauntness, the grey in his hair, the way his eyes occasionally moved to doors with the instinct of a man who'd spent years in a place where doors meant something different. But underneath all of that was someone very present, very sharp, with a quality of attention that Harry recognized because he'd been told all his life that he had his mother's eyes, but nobody had told him that whatever drove the way his mind moved, the quick assessment and the long view and the refusal to be managed, came in equal measure from the other side. Sirius looked at Harry and went very still. "You look like James," he said. "But you argue like Lily." "I've been told," Harry said, sitting down. They looked at each other across the table in the way that people look at each other when they're catching up on 12 years in a single glance and both know that the glance is insufficient and are doing it anyway. Harry felt something he didn't examine immediately, something warm and complicated and located somewhere he didn't usually feel things, which was the place reserved for things that were personal rather than strategic. He let himself feel it. He'd learned, over 3 years, that feeling things directly was better than examining them from a distance, as long as you didn't let the feeling make decisions that your reasoning should be making. "I've been reading your file," Harry said. "Since first year." Sirius blinked. "My file?" "The ministry document from the restricted section. You were in it as a marginal note. I started building backward from there." He watched Sirius's face, the movement of something that was gratitude and grief and a particular kind of disorientation. "I knew what happened before I knew you existed as a person, which is backwards but was what the information made possible." "You got me out," Sirius said. It was not quite a question. "Pettigrew got you out," Harry said precisely. "By being alive and catchable. I arranged the circumstances." Sirius looked at him for a long moment. 12 years old. 13, Harry said. Nearly 14. "That's, Harry," Sirius stopped. Started again with the deliberateness of someone who had prepared for a conversation and found the preparation inadequate. "I should have been there. For all of it. I should have, Dumbledore should have." "Yes," Harry said simply. "But you weren't and he didn't, and here we are." He met Sirius's eyes. "I'm not angry at you for it. I needed you to know that clearly, because I think you're going to spend a considerable amount of time being angry at yourself, and I'd rather you spent that energy on something more useful." Sirius stared at him. "You really do argue like Lily." "So I'm told." Harry picked up his butterbeer. "I need to talk to you about the ministry. About what you know, what you knew, from before. The Order of the Phoenix, who was in it, who they were. What Dumbledore's actual strategy was." He paused. "And what Voldemort's strategy was, from the inside, what you observed before the end." "You're asking me to debrief," Sirius said. "Yes." Sirius looked at him with that look, the same recalibration Harry seemed to produce in everyone who expected something else. Then he leaned back in his chair, wrapped his hands around his mug, and said, "All right. Where do you want to start?" "Voldemort," Harry said. Who were his inner circle? What did they want, individually? Not as a mass of Death Eaters, individually. Names, motivations, capabilities. Sirius talked for 2 hours. Harry took notes in the private notebook, the blue-covered one, filling pages with the kind of specific operational intelligence that no newspaper archive could provide, the inner structure of Voldemort's organization, the hierarchy of loyalty, which Death Eaters had been true believers and which had been opportunists, which had information that could be leveraged and which were dangerous enough that leverage was insufficient. At the end, Harry closed the notebook and said, "Voldemort is going to try to come back fully. This year or next." "You think so?" Sirius said. "I know so," Harry said. The Philosopher's Stone was one attempt, failed. The diary was a different mechanism, a Horcrux, a fragment of soul stored in an object. He watched Sirius's face react to the word Horcrux with the specific recognition of someone who knows the term. "You know what a Horcrux is? It's dark magic. Old dark magic. The blackest." "You're saying he made one?" "I destroyed one," Harry said. "In the Chamber of Secrets, 2nd year. The diary. But if he made one, he likely made more. The logic of the magic, if you're going to divide your soul, one piece is no safer than none. You'd want multiples." He looked at Sirius. "I've been trying to determine how many. I need access to Black family records. Your family had the most comprehensive library of dark artifact documentation in Wizarding Britain." "Grimmauld Place," Sirius said quietly. "Yes." Sirius was quiet for a moment. Looking at his godson across a pub table in the midwinter of a year that had already been more extraordinary than any year Sirius had lived through, and he had lived through the First War. "Harry," he said slowly, "how long have you been, how long has this been going on?" "Since I was 9, Harry said. Sirius closed his eyes. "Since, the cupboard under the stairs is a very good place to think," Harry said, without particular emotion. "I had a lot of time to do it." Sirius opened his eyes. They were bright and not quite steady. "I'm going to kill Vernon Dursley," he said, with the complete sincerity of someone stating a fact. "No," Harry said, mildly. "He's not relevant." Sirius. Harry looked at him. "There are people in this world who have done deliberate, calculated harm to other people from positions of power and walked away without consequence. Vernon Dursley is not one of them. He is a frightened, small-minded man who treated a child badly because he was afraid of what the child was. He's not on the list." He paused. "There is a list. He is not on it." Sirius looked at him for a long, complex moment. "There's a list," he said. "Yes. And things happen to people on it." Harry held his gaze and said nothing. Sirius, who was not stupid and was not naive and had spent 12 years in Azkaban developing a very clear sense of what real danger looked like and what performed danger looked like and which category he was currently sitting across from, nodded slowly. "Right," he said. "All right." He picked up his mug. "Grimmauld Place is yours. Any time you want." The Triwizard Tournament was announced in Harry's 4th year, and Harry's first response was entirely practical: the tournament was a trap. Not designed as a trap, necessarily. But functioning as one, because the sequence was too neat, an external competition requiring champions from each school, requiring magical binding of the participants, requiring them to perform in dangerous conditions without opting out. It was the perfect structure for getting Harry into a controlled situation with consequences enforced by magical contract. He said this to Hermione on the train north in September, and Hermione said, "I had the same thought," and then they worked through the mechanism together on the back of a charms assignment, determining that the contract only bound participants who'd entered willingly via the Goblet of Fire. "So the question is whether the goblet can be manipulated to produce a 4th name," Hermione said. "Age restriction charm on the entry," Harry said. Dumbledore designed it personally. But the goblet itself is a magical artifact that predates Hogwarts. Its criteria for selection is based on intention, not on external constraints. If someone submitted an entry under a different school's name, effectively creating a fourth school, the goblet would have to select a champion from each entered school, Hermione said. Her expression darkened. Including a false one. And once selected, the binding would be active. Yes, Harry said. Someone's going to put your name in. Someone's already planning to, Harry said. The question is who, and whether the tournament is the goal or just the access it provides. He thought about the Grimmauld Place library, which he'd spent 2 weeks of the summer going through with Sirius, building the Horcrux map. Thought about what Sirius had said about the inner circle, about who was capable of complex long-game strategy. Voldemort needs a body. He needs blood, specific blood, from specific people. The tournament provides a location and a structure and a legitimate reason for me to be in dangerous situations without raising alarms. We need to know who the inside man is, Hermione said. Moody, Harry said. The new defense teacher, or rather whoever was pretending to be moody, the eye too quick, the manner too sharp, the paranoia too specific and too performative. Not the real Auror. Someone using polyjuice. Hermione stared at him. Since when? Since the feast, Harry said. The real Moody has been in a trunk in his own office for a month. I've been watching. And you didn't. I needed to know the plan before I disrupted it, Harry said. Now I know enough. He looked at the passing countryside. My name's going into the goblet tonight. I'll be selected tomorrow morning. And then? And then I'll participate, Harry said. Because the magical binding is real and fighting it is counterproductive. But I'll participate on my terms, not theirs. He looked at her. The graveyard is where they want to get me. Wherever Voldemort is, wherever the ritual is planned. I'll go, but not unprepared. Harry, I need you to find the ritual, he said. The specific one. Flesh, blood, bone, that's what I've found so far, but the specific binding and its vulnerabilities. If I know the exact form of the ritual, I know the exact point at which it can be disrupted. He met her eyes. You have 2 months. The third task is when they'll try it. Hermione looked at him with the expression that was not fear and not anger and was something more complicated than both, the expression she'd been refining for 4 years of being Harry Potter's closest intellectual companion, which was the expression of someone who understood perfectly what he was doing and why and was simultaneously, constantly, aware of what it cost. You'll tell me everything, she said. Not a request. Everything, he said. Before you go anywhere. Before any task. Yes, he said. Promise me, she said, and the word landed differently than he expected, weighted with something specific, something she'd been building toward for a while, her jaw set and her eyes steady, and the 3 textbooks on her lap somehow made her look more, not less, serious. Harry looked at her. I promise, he said, and meant it completely, which was not something he committed to carelessly. Hermione nodded once, sharp, satisfied, and opened the top textbook, and the conversation was done and the agreement was made, and outside the window Scotland was beginning to show its edges in the changing light. He won the first task by doing something no champion was supposed to be able to do. The dragons were the first task, a Hungarian horntail for Harry, which he'd known in advance because Hagrid had shown him and Harry had made the necessary decisions about what to do with that knowledge. Most champions were planning diversionary strategies, complex transfigurations, distraction charms, methods of getting past the dragon while minimizing direct confrontation. Harry summoned his firebolt and flew. He'd thought about whether this was showing his hand too clearly, and had concluded that in this context, showing his hand was better than concealing it. Let everyone see what he was capable of. Let whoever was watching, Voldemort's agent, the false Moody, see him operate at full capacity and recalibrate their plan around someone considerably more capable than a 14-year-old was supposed to be. People who underestimated you were predictable. People who overestimated you were careful, and careful people made errors. He was so far ahead of the other champions by the end of the first task that the judges' scores were almost redundant. The second task, the lake, the hostages, he completed in 40 minutes, using a combination of gillyweed and a sonorous amplified wordless casting of the bubblehead charm that let him move faster than a branchiated breathing solution allowed. He retrieved his hostage, Hermione, which produced in him a cold, specific fury that he did not allow to change his strategy but filed very carefully under the heading of people who have decided those I care for are leverage, and then went back for the others because the alternative was leaving Gabrielle Delacour at the bottom of a lake, which was not something Harry was willing to do on the basis of, the rules say you only take your own. Rules that endangered children were not rules Harry was obligated to respect. He emerged from the lake with 4 people and stood on the bank while the crowd processed the fact that the champion had gone back, and the score was announced, not first place, because he'd exceeded the time limit, but close, and he didn't particularly care about the score. The third task came in June. The maze. He walked into it with everything he'd prepared, the ritual knowledge Hermione had found and annotated over 5 months, a set of counter-curses for the binding, 3 backup plans for different possible locations of the ritual site, and the death note in the inside pocket of his robes. He hadn't told Hermione about the death note. He hadn't told anyone. He'd thought about this carefully over 4 years. The death note was the one piece of the architecture that remained entirely his, not because he intended to use it wrongly, but because the decision-making around it required a level of certainty and personal accountability that he wasn't willing to share, not yet. Hermione would argue. She'd be right to argue. But she'd argue from principle and he needed to argue from data, and the data was his to assess. He moved through the maze quickly, efficiently, disarming curses that had been placed inside it and which were considerably more dangerous than the official task brief had suggested, which confirmed that whoever had set them had access to the maze's construction and had modified it. He encountered Victor Crumb under the Imperius curse and performed the counter-curse and left Crumb sitting against the maze wall, confused and grateful, and moved on. He found the Triwizard Cup. He stood in front of it for a moment, the maze walls high around him, the distant sounds of the crowd muffled by the hedges. He'd had 4 years to prepare for this moment. He had the ritual, the binding, the countermeasures. He had the death note. He had the understanding of what Voldemort needed and what Voldemort intended and where the architecture of the plan could be broken. He touched the cup. The portkey took him to a graveyard. It was exactly what he'd expected and still, for a single moment, deeply unpleasant in the specific way that knowing something intellectually and experiencing it physically are different categories of information. The graveyard was dark and cold, the kind of cold that June shouldn't produce in Britain. A marble headstone read Thomas Riddle. In the shadows between the graves, something moved, a bundle of robes, too small to be human, containing something that had stopped being human a long time ago. Harry put his wand in his hand and the death note in his other hand in one continuous motion, before Pettigrew had fully turned around. "Hold," Harry said. Pettigrew froze. He wasn't good at bravery, he'd never been good at bravery, it was the defining characteristic of his entire existence, and something in Harry's voice produced in him the same response it had produced in the Shrieking Shack, the recognition of someone who meant exactly what they said. The bundle of robes hissed. "I know what you need for the ritual," Harry said, to the thing in the robes, to the fragment of Voldemort that had been surviving parasitically since the night it had failed to kill a baby. "Bone, flesh, blood. My blood, specifically, because you need blood from an enemy. The ritual you've chosen will restore you, not to full strength, but to embodiment. Sufficient to act." He kept his voice completely steady. "I'm not going to let that happen." The thing in the robes hissed again, and this time the Parseltongue resolved, "You cannot stop it, boy. It is already beginning." "No," Harry said. "It isn't." He looked at the graveyard around him, the specific names on the headstones, the specific geography of the ritual site, all of it matching the information Hermione had compiled. At the base of the Riddle headstone, a cauldron. Not yet lit. Pettigrew standing between Harry and the cauldron, holding the bundle of robes, his damaged hand, missing the finger since the shrieking shack, trembling. "I've read the ritual," Harry said, in Parseltongue, because it was faster and because it would be heard. "The bone component is already done, Thomas Riddle is already in the ground. The flesh component requires Pettigrew's hand. The blood component requires me." He paused. "You only need 2 of the 3 to have something. Not a body, something. But if I remove Pettigrew from the equation, you have neither the flesh nor the blood, because I'm not giving you my blood and you can't take it without catching me, and you're not in a state to catch anyone." He'd thought about this moment specifically for 2 months. He'd thought about it with the honesty he applied to all the hard thinking. What outcome did he want? What was the cost of each option? What was he willing to do? What he was not willing to do was let Voldemort be reborn. What he was also not willing to do was kill Pettigrew here, in a graveyard, when Pettigrew's cooperation earlier in the year had been the mechanism of Sirius's freedom, and when Pettigrew's testimony was still the primary evidence in 3 ongoing ministry proceedings that Harry needed to conclude. He needed Pettigrew alive. He needed Voldemort unembodied. These 2 requirements together produced a very specific problem, which was that Pettigrew was the connection between them, and removing Pettigrew from the ritual without harming him meant physically getting between Pettigrew and the cauldron. Harry stepped forward. Pettigrew backed up. The bundle of robes hissed, "Stop him, fool," and Pettigrew's terror of the thing he was carrying was greater than his terror of Harry in this moment, which was useful information. Harry waved his wand and a binding charm took Pettigrew from knees to shoulders in one shot, dropping him to the grass where he lay rigid and, critically, not near the cauldron. Then Harry picked up the cauldron. It was large and heavy and made of iron and not designed for a 14-year-old to carry, but he was strong for his age in the way of people who've spent years doing physical labor that was phrased as household tasks, and he managed it, backing away from the ritual site with the cauldron in both arms while the thing in Pettigrew's robes, separate now from Pettigrew, lying in the grass, hissed and shrieked in the high helpless register of something that is entirely dependent on others and has been deprived of them. Harry took the cauldron 30 feet from the ritual site. He summoned a flame, a real one, hot, sustained. He burned the cauldron. Not what was in it, just the cauldron. To remove the ritual container from the equation. Then he stood over the robes containing what was left of Voldemort and looked at it. The death note was still in his left hand. He'd been holding it since the graveyard materialized. He looked at the bundle of robes, at the fragment of a person that had made itself less than a person in the pursuit of permanence, that had divided its own soul so many times that what remained of Tom Riddle was barely coherent, and thought about whether writing a name in this context was possible and right and sufficient. Can I kill something that isn't fully alive, he thought. Something that's a fragment. Something distributed across multiple objects. He looked at the dark figure in the grass and thought, not yet. Not until I know how many Horcruxes there are and where they are. Killing this fragment now just means the others persist, and a body can be found again. Better to leave this fragment without a body and work on the Horcruxes. He picked up the robes. He took out his wand. He modified Pettigrew's memory carefully, not erasing it, just fogging the specific sequence of the last 20 minutes. Enough that Pettigrew's testimony, under Veritaserum later, would be confused about the details. Then he put the bound Pettigrew over one shoulder and the robes containing Voldemort's remnant under his arm and touched the Triwizard Cup, which portkeyed him back to the maze entrance. He arrived in front of a crowd that had been waiting for champions to emerge, and what they saw was Harry Potter arriving with Pettigrew slung over his shoulder and a bundle of robes under his arm, and his expression absolutely unchanged from the expression he'd had when he went in. The silence was total and very loud. Then Dumbledore was there, moving through the crowd with a speed that belied his age, and his hand was on Harry's arm, and his blue eyes were very close and very sharp. "Harry. Are you hurt?" "No," Harry said. "This is Peter Pettigrew. He was at a graveyard. So was this." He held up the robes. "I believe this is what's left of Voldemort. He needs to be contained by someone who understands the specific requirements of containing a soul fragment. Dumbledore looked at the robes. At Pettigrew. At Harry. The expression on his face was not one Harry had seen before, not the benign warmth, not the deliberate opacity. Something more direct. Something that was, if Harry was reading it correctly, somewhere close to awe. The ritual, Dumbledore said. Didn't happen, Harry said. I disrupted it before the components could combine. He handed over the robes with the careful steadiness of someone handing over a thing they are very glad to no longer be holding. You should know there are Horcruxes. Plural. I've been building the list. I'll share it with you tomorrow, if you're willing to work on this together. Together, Dumbledore said, slowly, as though tasting the word and finding it unusual. I'm not doing this alone, Harry said. And you're not doing it without me. He met the old man's eyes. Together means both of those things. Dumbledore looked at him for a very long moment. Around them the crowd was pressing forward and the other champions were emerging from the maze and someone was crying and someone else was shouting and the whole magnificent chaos of an interrupted event was unfolding. Together, Dumbledore said. Good, Harry said. Now I'd quite like to sit down. He sat in the hospital wing that night with Hermione on one side and Sirius, who had come the moment the owl had reached him, which was fast enough that Harry suspected Sirius had been somewhere nearby, on the other, and Ron at the foot of the bed eating something out of a paper bag with the focused comfort eating of someone who had been very frightened and was now transitioning out of it. You went to the graveyard, Hermione said. Her voice was completely even. Her hands were flat on the bedsheet. Yes, Harry said. You went to the graveyard and didn't tell me where the portkey would take you. I told you everything about the ritual and the ritual site and the countermeasures, Harry said. I didn't know the exact coordinates. That is technically true, Hermione said, and also a complete non-answer. I know, Harry said. You came back, she said, and the evenness in her voice shifted at the end of it, just slightly, enough to let through something that was not anger and was considerably more difficult than anger. Harry looked at her. I came back, he said. I will keep coming back. That's not a promise I make lightly. Hermione looked at him. Looked at her hands on the bedsheet. Then she picked up the closest book and opened it to a random page and stared at it, which was her version of gathering herself. Sirius, who had been watching this exchange with the expression of someone who was observing something and choosing to observe it rather than comment, caught Harry's eye and did something with his eyebrows that communicated approximately a volume of commentary in total silence. Harry looked at the ceiling. The Horcrux list, he said, to the room in general. Tomorrow I'm meeting with Dumbledore to share it. I want you both there. He glanced at Sirius. And you, if you can be present without technically violating your release conditions. My relationship with release conditions is complicated, Sirius said, in the tone of someone who finds this charming about himself. I need the Black family library records, Harry said. Specifically anything on the objects Voldemort would have had access to in the late 1970s. Items of significance. Historical magical artifacts. You think he used family heirlooms, Sirius said slowly. I think someone who was obsessed with legacy and permanence would use objects that carried the weight of history, Harry said. The diary was a school-era object, personal, significant. The others will be similar. Things that mattered. He looked at the ceiling. I have 6 candidates. I need to narrow it. 6, Sirius said. 7 total souls, Harry said. With the one in the diary destroyed, that's 6 remaining. Including the one you brought back tonight in the robes, which Dumbledore is containing. He looked at his hands. I think one of them is me. The room went very quiet. The scar, Hermione said. Her voice was careful. The night he tried to kill me, Harry said. A killing curse that rebounded, that's not a clean event, magically. Something happened in that moment. If he'd already made multiple Horcruxes by then, his soul was unstable. Fragmented enough that the violence of the rebound might have split it further. He kept his voice entirely steady. If there's a fragment of his soul in me, destroying it becomes part of this. Hermione's hand moved. It found his, on the bedsheet, and closed around it. She didn't say anything. Harry looked at her hand on his and felt that thing again, the warm complicated thing from the 3 broomsticks, from the train, from 100 moments over 4 years that he'd filed and not examined and was now looking at directly for the first time. He turned his hand over and held hers back. "We'll figure it out," she said quietly. "Yes," Harry said. "We will." Outside the hospital wing windows, the Hogwarts grounds were dark and enormous and quiet, and somewhere in the castle, contained in whatever vessel Dumbledore had found for it, the remnant of Voldemort waited, less than before, diminished, deprived of its body and its plan and the certainty it had carried into a graveyard on a June night, unaware that the boy it had tried to kill for 14 years had spent those years building the specific, patient architecture of its end. Harry lay in the hospital wing and thought about Horcruxes. About the list. About what came next. He was 14. He was not, by any measure, finished.